Beyond the northernmost reaches of the Roman Empire, far from the warmth and wealth of Mediterranean civilization, lay a harsh and unforgiving realm. Here, where winter reigned supreme for half the year, a people were being forged in nature's most demanding crucible. The geographical isolation of Scandinavia created a unique cultural incubator that would eventually produce one of history's most misunderstood and influential societies. Scandinavia stands as a land of dramatic contrasts. In summer, the midnight sun bathes the northern reaches in perpetual light, while winter darkness consumes the days, broken only by the ethereal dance of the aurora borealis. This rhythm of extreme light and darkness shaped not only the practical aspects of Norse life, but infiltrated their worldview and spiritual understanding. Geography shaped destiny here more profoundly than perhaps anywhere else in Europe, isolated by seas to the west and south, mountains to the east, and polar ice to the north. These northern peoples developed in relative seclusion from continental influences. The scarcity of farmland, merely 5% of Scandinavia's rugged terrain could support crops, demanded extraordinary innovation and resourcefulness from its inhabitants. Where Mediterranean civilizations flourished in abundance, the Norse character was tempered by perpetual scarcity. Survival in this environment demanded ruthless efficiency. Every seed planted, every animal raised, every fish caught represented the difference between life and death when winter descended. This wasn't a land that forgave carelessness or rewarded individual glory at the expense of community welfare. Such environmental pressures selected for certain cultural traits: pragmatism, cooperation, and a keen understanding of natural systems. The Norse developed a society where practical skills earned more respect than abstract philosophy, a cultural value that would later manifest in their approach to exploration, trade, and warfare. The rhythms of life followed nature's unyielding calendar. 6 months to produce and preserve enough food to survive 6 months of scarcity. Every member of the community, from eldest to youngest, played their vital role in this perpetual dance with survival. Where Mediterranean cultures could afford specialized labor and leisure classes, Norse society required universal participation. This necessity bred an egalitarian streak that would later manifest in their legal structures and communal decision-making processes. While the land offered limited bounty, the sea provided both pathway and sustenance. Early Scandinavians learned to read the moods of these waters, harvesting their depths and eventually using them as roads to new horizons. The same waters that isolated them would one day become the highways of their expansion. Maritime expertise wasn't merely a specialized skill, but a fundamental aspect of Norse identity. Their intimate understanding of wind, weather, and wave would later transform into an unmatched nautical prowess that opened half the known world to their influence. The long winter nights fostered a culture of storytelling and craftsmanship, while outside winds howled across frozen landscapes. Inside the smoky warmth of longhouses, communities strengthened their bonds through shared oral tradition. Tales of ancestors, gods, and heroes preserved both history and wisdom, passing vital knowledge between generations. This storytelling tradition would eventually blossom into one of the world's great literary legacies, the Norse sagas. The family unit stood as the foundation of Norse society. More than merely blood relations, these extended households functioned as economic units, legal entities, and the primary source of individual protection and identity. In a world where every day presented challenges, one's family determined not just social standing, but chances of survival. Unlike the Roman pater familias model, Norse family structure granted notable autonomy to women, who controlled household economies and, in their husband's absence, all aspects of family prosperity. Communities formed organically, where harbours offered shelter for fishing vessels, or where valleys provided enough fertile ground to support several families. These settlements remained small and self-sufficient, each developing distinct identities while sharing common cultural threads that bound together the people of the North. The limited population that the land could support created a demographic pressure that would later become one catalyst for the Viking expansion. From earliest childhood, Northern youth were trained in skills that would ensure both their survival and their community's prosperity. The harsh environment left little room for frivolity. Even children's games served to develop strength, coordination, and the ability to withstand discomfort. This practical education system produced individuals who valued skill and competence above abstract learning, a cultural emphasis that would later manifest in their technical innovations in shipbuilding, navigation, and metalwork. This seasonal cycle, repeated generation after generation, century after century, gradually molding a people uniquely adapted to their challenging homeland. Self-reliance became not just a virtue, but a necessity. Resourcefulness in the face of scarcity developed into ingenuity. Endurance through long winters cultivated patience and strategic thinking. These qualities, forged in isolation and hardship, would one day become the foundation of Norse expansion across Europe and beyond. Even in death, the connection to both family and the natural world remained paramount. The deceased were often buried with the tools that defined their lives, overlooking the waters or lands they had worked, becoming part of the landscape that had shaped them. This intimate connection between identity and environment reflected a worldview where human existence was inseparable from the natural forces that enabled it. In this northern crucible, elements both nurturing and merciless combined to forge something unique, a people tempered by adversity, bonded by necessity, and ultimately shaped by the very isolation that would one day drive them to venture beyond their shores. The geographic seclusion that had protected their cultural development would eventually give way to one of history's most remarkable periods of expansion. The harsh beauty of this realm, where natural forces held such sway over human existence, inevitably shaped the Norse spiritual understanding. In a world where survival balanced on nature's knife edge, the people of the North developed a complex mythology to explain their precarious existence. Stories of gods and giants whose conflicts mirrored the elemental struggles they witnessed every day. At the heart of Norse understanding lay a cosmology both profound and pragmatic, reflecting the harsh realities and remarkable beauty of their northern home. Unlike the distant, perfect deities of Mediterranean faiths, Norse gods manifested as powerful yet flawed beings, subject to fate and mortality, a pantheon as unpredictable as the northern weather and as complex as the society that worshipped them. The Norse creation myth spoke of primordial forces shaping existence from chaos. Before gods or humans, there existed only Ginnungagap, the yawning void between ice and fire. From this cosmic crucible emerged the frost giant Ymir, first of living beings, from whose body the gods would later craft the world. This Genesis story reflected the Norse experience of emergence from harsh extremes, where life constantly negotiated between opposing elemental forces. The 9 worlds branching from the cosmic world tree embodied the Norse understanding of a complex, layered universe where different realms of existence occupied their own spheres, yet remained interconnected through a central axis. Presiding over this cosmology stood Odin, the All-Father and chief of the Aesir gods, epitomizing the complexity of Norse divinity. Unlike the perfect, omnipotent deities of southern traditions, Odin embodied paradox and contradiction, a god of both wisdom and war, poetry and treachery, nobility and deception. His character mirrored the multifaceted demands placed upon Norse leaders. One-eyed from sacrificing half his sight for knowledge, Odin eternally sought wisdom, willing to endure personal suffering for greater understanding, a reflection of the Norse pragmatic view that nothing valuable comes without cost. Accompanied by ravens named Thought and Memory, riding an eight-legged steed born of trickery, Odin wandered the worlds in disguise, testing mortals and gathering knowledge for the final battle at world's end. His halls of Valhalla, where fallen warriors feasted and fought eternally, offered a warrior culture's ideal afterlife, not peaceful rest, but glorious preparation for cosmic battle. This conception speaks volumes about a society where combat readiness represented not merely a path to glory, but essential survival skill in a hostile world. Where Odin represented aristocratic complexity and arcane wisdom, Thor embodied more accessible virtues for common people. The thunder god, with his mighty hammer Mjolnir, stood as protector of both gods and humans against the chaotic forces of the giants. Thor's straightforward strength, reliability, and occasional buffoonery made him beloved among farmers and common folk who valued practical power over Odin's enigmatic schemes. The thunderstorms bearing his name brought fertility to fields, linking his worship directly to agricultural prosperity. His red beard and mighty appetite connected him to hearth and home, making him the divine embodiment of common Norse masculine ideals: strength without pretension, power wielded in defense of community rather than personal glory. Balancing the masculine divine forces, the goddess Freya represented feminine power in its many aspects. Associated with love, beauty, fertility, war, and death, she claimed half the battles slain for her own hall, challenging the notion that warfare belonged exclusively to male deities. Her ceremonies connected to cycles of birth, growth, and renewal, while her famous necklace, Brisingamen, symbolized the earth's abundance and feminine beauty. Fertility cults centered on Freya and her brother Freya ensured that in a land where growing seasons were perilously short, divine forces would bless human reproduction and agricultural fertility alike. Complexity and ambiguity found their ultimate expression in Loki, the trickster figure whose shape-shifting nature defied simple categorization. Neither fully god nor giant, neither wholly evil nor good, Loki represented the unpredictability that Norse people recognized in their world. His cleverness resolved divine crises he often created himself, making him both problem and solution, helper and saboteur. Like the wildfires that destroy yet regenerate forests, or the winter that kills yet prepares for spring renewal, Loki embodied necessary chaos within the cosmic order. His eventual binding, punishment for orchestrating the beloved Baldur's death, represented the temporary containment of chaotic forces that must eventually break free to fulfill cosmic destiny. Binding together all realms and beings stood Yggdrasil, the world tree, cosmic axis and living entity supporting existence itself. Its three roots extended to different wells and realms, while various creatures lived within its branches and trunk. This central metaphor conveyed the Norse understanding of interconnection between all living things, all dimensions of existence. The tree suffered constant damage, yet endured, gnawed by beasts, fed by springs, evergreen despite perpetual assault. No image better captured the Norse worldview of life as persistent endurance against ongoing challenge. Running through this mythology, like threads through a tapestry, was the concept of weird, fate, or destiny, personified by the three Norns who wove the threads of all lives at the base of Yggdrasil. Unlike deterministic fate in other traditions, Norse word incorporated elements of past actions influencing future possibilities, creating a complex interplay between predetermined destiny and individual choice. The Norns, representing past, present, and future, wove patterns even the gods could not fully escape, establishing boundaries within which free will operated. This sophisticated understanding reflected a society intimately familiar with natural constraints, yet determined to exercise agency within them. Perhaps most telling about Norse spiritual understanding was their conception of Ragnarok, the inevitable twilight of the gods, where cosmic order would dissolve in fire and flood before a new world emerged from the destruction. Unlike apocalyptic visions promising salvation for the faithful, Ragnarok promised destruction for all, even the gods themselves. This unflinching acceptance of inevitable end reflected a culture that faced difficult truths without illusion. The Norse found meaning not in avoiding fate, but in facing it with courage and integrity. That gods themselves would die fighting against chaos, knowing they could not win but refusing to surrender, established the ultimate model for Norse behavior in the face of adversity. This rich mythology was not merely abstract storytelling, but practical psychology, offering models for understanding natural phenomena, human behavior, and social dynamics. When thunder rolled across fjords, Thor was battling giants. When battle frenzy overtook warriors, Odin had granted his gift. When someone proved particularly cunning in negotiations, Loki's influence might be suspected. The gods walked through daily life, making the mythology a lived experience rather than distant theology. Rituals and ceremonies embedded these cosmic understandings into community practice. From great blots at Uppsala or other major centers to household offerings at critical seasonal junctures, religious observance connected human communities to divine forces. Sacred groves, stones, and natural features across the landscape marked places where the boundary between worlds grew thin. Women often served as vulva or practitioners of cider magic, maintaining particular connection to divine knowledge through altered consciousness and ritual practice. Unlike later religious systems that would arrive from the south, Norse spirituality made no sharp distinction between sacred and secular. The gods concerned themselves with harvests and childbirth as much as warfare and wisdom. Their flaws and failings made them relatable rather than distant. Their stories provided both entertainment during long winter nights and essential wisdom about navigating a challenging world. This integrated spiritual worldview would eventually face its greatest challenge from Christianity, a faith offering very different answers to questions of cosmic meaning and human purpose. Between the harsh dictates of northern geography and the complex spiritual framework of Norse cosmology, emerged a society structured around principles of both hierarchy and participation. Unlike the rigid feudalism developing elsewhere in Europe, Norse communities balanced strong leadership with remarkable elements of proto-democratic process, creating a social order that fostered both individual capability and collective action. Central to Norse social organization was the Thing, assembly of free men gathering to resolve disputes, establish laws, and make communal decisions. These gatherings ranged from local things handling everyday matters to regional assemblies addressing broader concerns. At specified locations, often ancient sacred sites, free men would assemble to hear cases, witness oaths, and participate in governance through direct voice rather than representation. This practice of communal decision-making established one of Europe's earliest forms of participatory governance, where even modest landholders could theoretically speak before the assembly and influence collective choices. Law itself stood not as written code, but as memorized wisdom, preserved orally and recited at things by the law speaker, an elected official whose prestigious role required phenomenal memory and absolute verbal precision. In a pre-literate society, these individuals embodied living legal tradition, reciting established precedent and procedure without benefit of written reference. The Old Norse word lag, law, itself connected to concepts of that which is laid down or proper order, revealing how legal understanding grew from communal agreement rather than imposed authority. This legal tradition would eventually produce sophisticated codes across Norse territories, from Iceland's Gragas to Norway's Gulating law. Women within this emerging society occupied a position of notable, if circumscribed, autonomy compared to contemporaries elsewhere in Europe. While excluded from formal participation in things, Norse women controlled household economics, held property rights, and could initiate divorce, legal protections remarkable for the early medieval period. Archaeological evidence and later literary references suggest women managed farms, conducted trade, and maintained household prosperity during men's extended absences. The keys hanging at a housewife's belt symbolized her authority within the domestic sphere, not merely servant but manager of essential resources upon which family survival depended. Marriage in Norse society functioned primarily as economic and political alliance between families rather than romantic union. Elaborate negotiations determined bride price and dowry, establishing the material foundation for new households, while cementing bonds between kinship groups. Yet within these arranged partnerships, Norse law protected women's dignity and autonomy to a remarkable degree. Physical abuse, sexual neglect, or even a husband's excessive stinginess constituted grounds for divorce, with the woman entitled to reclaim her property. While men technically held greater public authority, wise husbands recognized that domestic harmony required partnership rather than domination, particularly given women's essential economic contributions to household survival. Leadership in early Norse society rested not on divine right or inherited privilege, but demonstrated competence. The title Jarl originally designated not inherited nobility, but exceptional individuals who had proven themselves capable of leading others through personal qualities. While sons of successful leaders certainly enjoyed advantages, early Norse society maintained remarkable social mobility compared to contemporaries elsewhere in Europe. A free man of modest birth might, through skill in arms, shrewd trading, or demonstrated wisdom, rise to significant influence and leadership. Conversely, a chieftain's son showing cowardice or incompetence would find his authority quickly challenged by more capable competitors. As population and complexity grew, tribal chieftains emerged as first among equals, individuals whose demonstrated abilities, wealth, and connections allowed them to mobilize wider groups beyond immediate kin. These leaders hosted feasts, mediated disputes, led seasonal rituals, and organized defensive forces, gaining followers through demonstrated generosity and perceived connection to divine favor. A chieftain's hall became both political center and symbolic heart of the community, where abundance was shared, alliances formed, and social bonds reinforced through communal feasting and ritual. Competition for resources drove early conflicts between communities, setting patterns that would later expand to international scale. Raiding neighboring settlements for cattle, grain, iron, or other essentials represented not merely banditry, but established method for resource redistribution when local production fell short. These limited seasonal conflicts rarely aimed at territorial conquest or complete destruction of enemies, instead functioning as pressure release mechanisms in a challenging environment where resources fluctuated unpredictably. The same pragmatism that guided Norse approach to survival influenced their approach to conflict. Violence employed strategically rather than ideologically, with practical goals foremost. At society's base stood the free farmer, the practical foundation of Norse society. Neither aristocrat nor serf, these independent landholders formed the backbone of economic production, military capacity, and social stability. Their farms, though modest by southern European standards, represented both economic units and extensions of family identity across generations. Working land cleared by ancestors, passing skills and property to descendants, the bondi embodied Norse values of independence, practical competence, and connection to place. Their presence at things ensured that Norse governance, while led by elites, could never entirely ignore the interests and voices of ordinary producers. Below free farmers in social hierarchy stood freedmen, former slaves who had gained liberty through manumission, purchase of freedom, or exceptional service. These individuals occupied ambiguous social position, legally free but carrying the stigma of former servitude. Their children, however, could generally expect full integration into free society, demonstrating Norse pragmatism regarding human capacity rather than rigid caste thinking. At society's bottom existed thralls, enslaved individuals captured in conflict or born to enslaved parents. Though deprived of legal rights and subject to their owner's will, even thralls possessed some customary protections and paths to potential freedom, not typically found in other slave-holding societies. The seasonal rhythm of Norse life established predictable patterns that ordered society through the year. Spring brought planting, ship repair, and preparation for potential summer expeditions. Summer saw intensive farming, fishing, and the possibility of trading or raiding voyages for those not required at home. Autumn demanded harvest, preservation, and storage activities essential for winter survival. Winter itself, though challenging, provided time for crafting, storytelling, and social activities that strengthened community bonds during months when agricultural work became impossible. This seasonal cycle structured expectations, roles, and communal activities in ways that reinforced social cohesion while maximizing survival prospects. Underpinning Norse social organization lay an honor culture whose principles influenced every aspect of interpersonal relations. Personal reputation, especially for reliability, courage, and generosity, represented essential social currency, with perceived insults requiring active response to preserve standing. Unlike later medieval concepts of honor, centering on bloodline or titles, Norse honor emphasized demonstrated qualities and kept social hierarchies somewhat fluid. This honor system created both social stability through predictable behavioral codes and instability through potentially escalating feuds when honor demands conflicted. Blood feuds themselves functioned as primitive legal system, ensuring that violations against individuals became concern of entire kinship groups, thus deterring casual violence. The knowledge that harming one person might require facing their entire family served as powerful check on antisocial behavior in communities lacking police or standing military. When killings did occur, elaborate compensation systems allowed for restoration of balance without endless retaliation. These vergild payments, precisely calculated based on the victim's social standing, transformed blood debt into material debt that could be resolved without further violence, demonstrating Norse pragmatism even in matters of life and death. As the 7th century progressed, this social order faced increasing pressure from both internal development and external contact. Growing populations strained available resources, while political consolidation began challenging the independence of local chieftains. Contact with the wealthy, centralized kingdoms developing elsewhere in Europe introduced new models of governance, wealth, and power that ambitious Norse leaders observed with interest. The social foundation had been laid for transformation from isolated tribal communities into the interconnected, expansionary culture that would eventually burst upon the European stage. The people of the North had been shaped by their environment, their beliefs, and their social structures into something unique, a society poised on the edge of remarkable expansion. While Norse raiders would later gain fame primarily for their destructive capabilities, their society first distinguished itself through remarkable creative skills. From the utilitarian to the artistic, Norse craftsmanship developed sophisticated techniques that not only ensured survival in challenging conditions, but eventually produced works of such beauty and technical sophistication that they remain objects of admiration 13 centuries later. These craft traditions emerged not as luxury enterprises, but as essential components of a society where self-sufficiency represented necessity rather than choice. Woodworking formed the foundation of Norse material culture, an unsurprising specialization given Scandinavia's vast forests of pine, oak, birch, and ash. From the earliest settlements, Norse craftsmen developed intimate knowledge of different woods' properties, which varieties resisted rot for building foundations, which provided flexibility for tools, which burned cleanest for winter heating. Using axes, adzes, knives, and augers, they transformed raw lumber into virtually everything required for northern life. Houses, furniture, wagons, barrels, bowls, tools, weapons, and most significantly, boats. The Norse carpenter achieved versatility unmatched elsewhere in Europe, capable of producing both utilitarian items and objects of remarkable aesthetic refinement. Longhouses exemplified Norse woodworking at architectural scale. These multi-purpose buildings, typically between 15 to 75 meters long, housed extended families under a single roof, with central hearths providing warmth through brutal winters. Their post and beam construction, often with walls of horizontal planks or wattle and daub between structural elements, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of load distribution and environmental engineering. Slightly curved roof beams shed snow while providing maximum interior volume, and carefully positioned smoke holes balanced ventilation against heat conservation. These structures achieved remarkable efficiency in a challenging climate, while establishing the archetypal space for Norse social and family life. Even more significant than their architectural achievements, early Scandinavian woodworkers began developing the vessel forms that would eventually transform European history. Beginning with simple, dugout canoes hollowed from single logs, coastal communities gradually refined their boat-building techniques over generations. The earliest evidence of plank-built boats dates to the pre-Viking era, showing that essential shipbuilding skills were being developed well before the age of expansion. These proto-longships, though smaller and less sophisticated than their later descendants, already demonstrated the fundamental design principles that would eventually produce history's most versatile watercraft: light construction, shallow draft, and inherent seaworthiness. Metalworking initially developed more slowly in Scandinavia than woodcraft, primarily due to limited local ore deposits and fewer connections to regions with advanced metallurgical traditions. Early Norse ironworking utilized bog iron, deposits formed by bacteria in marshlands rather than mined ore, laboriously harvested and smelted in small bloomery furnaces reaching temperatures of 1100 to 1400 degrees Celsius. This resource-intensive process requiring approximately 300 kilograms of charcoal to produce 30 kilograms of iron, made metal a precious commodity used sparingly and recycled whenever possible. The difficult extraction process fostered deep appreciation for metalwork that later manifested in both practical engineering and extraordinary decorative elaboration. Blacksmiths occupied ambiguous social positions, their essential skills earning respect, while their transformation of materials through mysterious processes sometimes generated suspicion. Smiths' tools, hammers, tongs, anvils, files, punches, themselves represented significant investments of resources and technical knowledge. The gradual adoption of pattern welding techniques, where layers of iron with different carbon contents were forge welded together to combine hardness with flexibility, demonstrated increasing sophistication. By the 7th century, skilled Norse smiths could produce tools, weapons, and ornamental items whose quality rivaled those found anywhere in Europe, laying technical foundation for the superlative weapons that would later make Viking warriors so formidable. Textile production, though less dramatic than metalworking or shipbuilding, constituted essential craft tradition primarily in women's domain. From raw materials, wool from sheep, flax from cultivated fields, or occasionally imported cotton, Norse women created the fabric necessary for survival in northern climates. The process involved numerous specialized skills: shearing, sorting, cleaning, carding, spinning, weaving, cutting, and sewing. Throughout long winter evenings, the rhythmic sounds of spindle whirls and looms would fill Norse households as women transformed raw fibers into essential products. The warp-weighted loom, standing upright against house walls, produced fabrics of remarkable quality despite technological simplicity, demonstrating how accumulated expertise could overcome equipment limitations. Clothing, designed for northern climate, showcased both practical engineering and cultural identity. Multiple layers, beginning with linen undergarments that absorbed perspiration, followed by insulating wool, and topped with weather-resistant outer layers, created adaptable protection against environmental extremes. Tight-fitting sleeves and leggings minimized heat loss while allowing freedom of movement for work. Far from the horned helmet stereotypes of modern imagination, archaeological evidence reveals practical garments optimized for actual environmental conditions. Trousers, tunics, cloaks, and boots constructed for durability and function, enhanced with decorative elements communicating social standing, regional identity, and aesthetic sensibility. While practical necessity drove much early craft development, Norse artisans simultaneously cultivated sophisticated decorative traditions that transformed functional objects into expressions of cultural values and aesthetic sensibility. The animal styles that would later characterize Viking art began emerging in the migration period, initially showing Germanic influences before developing distinctively Norse characteristics. These early decorative schemes, with stylized animals interlaced in complex patterns, reflected a worldview where boundaries between human, animal, and supernatural realms remained permeable. Applied to wooden chests, metal brooches, textile borders, or carved doorposts, these designs added cultural meaning to utilitarian objects. Specialized crafts gradually emerged to support growing social complexity. Boat builders developed increasingly distinct expertise from general carpenters. Jewelry making separated from utilitarian metalwork. Comb makers worked primarily with antler and bone to create personal care items that also served as status symbols. Stone carvers produced everyday querns for grinding grain alongside commemorative runic monuments. This craft specialization reflected increasing social stratification and resource accumulation that allowed some individuals to focus exclusively on particular skills, rather than maintaining the generalist capabilities required in earlier, more subsistence-oriented communities. Trade connections with Baltic regions introduced new materials and techniques that expanded Norse craft possibilities. Amber from Baltic shores, transported through emerging trade networks, provided both valuable export commodity and distinctive material for indigenous artisans. Glass beads, initially imported from distant manufacturing centers, inspired local experimentation with this exotic material. Bronze casting techniques, transmitted through contact with more technically advanced southern neighbors, allowed creation of distinctive brooches, buckles, and ritual items combining utilitarian function with complex symbolism. These external influences were never simply adopted, but always adapted into distinctively Norse forms, consistent with local aesthetic traditions. Archaeological evidence from this pre-Viking period reveals intriguing technological literacy among northern craftspeople. Specialized tools designed for specific tasks, like the cooper's crows for cutting grooves in barrel staves, or the shipwright's specialized adzes, demonstrate sophisticated understanding of engineering principles. The gradual standardization of weights and measures facilitated both production consistency and fair exchange. Innovations like the rotary quern, replacing exhausting back-and-forth grinding with circular motion, doubled or tripled efficiency in essential food processing. These practical innovations laid groundwork for the technical advantages that would later give Norse voyagers decisive edges in their expansionary activities. By the late 7th century, Norse craft traditions had established both technical foundations and cultural frameworks that would enable their remarkable expansion in subsequent centuries. Their woodworking had produced the vessels that would carry them across challenging seas. Their metalworking had developed the tools and weapons that would make them formidable both as settlers and raiders. Their textile arts had created the clothing that protected them in diverse environments. Most importantly, their craft ethos had cultivated cultural values, emphasizing practical problem-solving, technical innovation, and the ability to adapt skills to new challenges and opportunities. Qualities that would prove decisive when the people of the North finally looked beyond their shores. While Norse society developed its distinctive characteristics in northern isolation, the European world beyond Scandinavia underwent seismic transformations that would eventually create both opportunity and incentive for Norse expansion. The centuries following Rome's collapse witnessed the painful birth of medieval Europe, a process that simultaneously created power vacuums into which Norse energy would eventually flow, and concentrated new wealth that would become irresistibly tempting targets for northern opportunists. Rome's fall represented not merely regime change, but systemic collapse across Western Europe. Road networks deteriorated without imperial maintenance. Cities shrank dramatically as urban services failed. Trade contracted to local scales as insecurity made long-distance commerce increasingly hazardous. Most significantly for future events, professional military establishments disappeared, replaced by ad hoc forces raised by regional strongmen. Beyond Rome's former frontiers, these changes registered primarily through diminished luxury imports and reduced pressure from southern powers, creating space for indigenous cultural development while limiting economic opportunities connected to wider networks. In this post-Roman landscape, the Frankish kingdom gradually emerged as Western Europe's dominant power. From relatively modest origins as one Germanic group among many, the Franks expanded their control first under Merovingian and then Carolingian dynasties. By the time Charlemagne consolidated his continental empire in the late 8th century, Frankish territory stretched from the Atlantic to the Elbe, from the North Sea to northern Italy. This political concentration created unprecedented wealth accumulation in post-Roman Western Europe, particularly in religious establishments founded or enriched by Frankish rulers. Monasteries, cathedrals, and palaces throughout Francia contained treasures whose fame would eventually reach northern ears. Britain followed different trajectory after Roman withdrawal. Anglo-Saxon migrations established new kingdoms across former Britannia, gradually developing from pagan tribal groupings into increasingly sophisticated Christian polities. By the 7th century, kingdoms like Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Kent, and Wessex had established relatively stable borders, written legal codes, and economic systems generating modest prosperity. Particularly significant for future events, the British Isles saw extraordinary flourishing of monastic establishments. Lindisfarne, Iona, Jarrow, and numerous others, where religious communities created unprecedented concentrations of portable wealth in the form of elaborate gospel books, ceremonial objects, and precious reliquaries, all inadequately defended at strategic coastal locations. Christianity's expansion across Northern Europe during this period represented more than religious change. It introduced fundamental structural alterations to societies it penetrated. Literacy, previously rare or non-existent in northern regions, accompanied Christian missionaries, enabling new forms of knowledge transmission and political organization. Latin provided common language for international communication and institutional development. Monastic communities established economic centers independent of traditional tribal structures. Christian political theory legitimized kingship as divinely sanctioned office, rather than merely successful chieftaincy, accelerating royal centralization efforts. Perhaps most consequentially, Christian ethics officially rejected violence as problem-solving mechanism, precisely when Northern Europe required new defensive capabilities. Trade networks that had connected Roman world contracted significantly during the post-imperial centuries, though never disappeared entirely. Mediterranean exchange diminished as Islamic expansion created new political boundaries. Continental routes became more hazardous without imperial peace ensuring traveler safety. Luxury goods that had flowed northward during Roman era, wine, fine ceramics, glassware, textiles, became increasingly rare and valuable. This contraction had particularly significant impact on northern European peripheral regions, including Scandinavia, whose limited exports had previously secured modest participation in wider economic networks. The Norse found themselves increasingly isolated from wealth-generating systems developing elsewhere, creating economic incentives that would eventually motivate their explosive outward expansion. Northern Europe's political landscape remained fragmented compared to areas where Roman administrative traditions lingered. Beyond former imperial frontiers, tribal structures gradually evolved into proto-kingdoms with limited territorial control and administrative capacity. Regional strongmen consolidated power over modest territories, typically centered on particularly productive agricultural regions or strategic trade locations. Defense against neighboring competitors, rather than offensive ambition, primarily drove political development, creating patchwork of small polities vulnerable to determined coordinated assault. This fragmentation would eventually prove fatal when confronted with Norse expeditionary forces capable of concentrating power rapidly at chosen targets before dispersing to avoid counterattack. Urban development followed distinctive trajectories across post-Roman Europe, with significant implications for later events. In formerly Roman territories, diminished but surviving cities maintained some manufacturing capacity and administrative functions. New commercial centers emerged at strategic locations, particularly river confluences or natural harbors. though these rarely approached Roman predecessors in size or sophistication. Many of these developing urban centers, located along navigable waterways for commercial advantage, inadvertently positioned themselves as perfect targets for seaborne raiders capable of rapid assault and retreat. Their wealth concentration, combined with strategic vulnerability, would eventually create irresistible opportunities for Norse maritime opportunists. The intellectual transformation accompanying Christianization reshaped Northern European worldviews, with consequences extending far beyond theology. Christian cosmology presented radically different understanding of time, linear rather than cyclical, moral framework universal rather than tribal, and metaphysical structure monotheistic rather than polytheistic. Monasteries preserved classical learning while developing new intellectual traditions, synthesizing Germanic, Celtic, and Mediterranean elements. This intellectual revolution remained incomplete and unevenly distributed, creating cultural tension between traditional indigenous values and imported ideological systems. The Norse, largely insulated from these changes until the Viking Age, would eventually encounter Christian Europe as cultural outsiders whose values and practices appeared incomprehensible or abhorrent to increasingly Christianized societies. Technological developments during this transitional period set important conditions for future conflicts. Heavy cavalry emerged as dominant battlefield force, particularly after stirrup adoption improved mounted combat effectiveness. Infantry forces evolved from tribal levies into better organized units, though still raised primarily for specific campaigns rather than maintained as standing armies. Fortification techniques advanced beyond simple earthworks to include stone construction and more sophisticated defensive engineering. Naval technology, however, remained relatively stagnant in post-Roman West, with Mediterranean ship types poorly suited to Atlantic conditions and Northern European traditions still focused on riverine rather than maritime capabilities. This military technological landscape created vulnerability to precisely the kind of mobile, maritime-based warfare that Norse raiders would eventually perfect. By the late 7th century, specific conditions had emerged across Northern Europe that would prove catastrophically vulnerable to Norse operational methods once developed and deployed. Wealth had concentrated in predictable locations, particularly religious establishments, often near coasts or navigable waterways. Defensive systems had oriented toward land-based threats rather than seaborne attack. Political fragmentation prevented coordinated response to mobile aggressors. Most significantly, Christian ethical frameworks had undermined warrior ethos precisely when effective defense demanded rapid, violent response to external threat. These conditions resulted not from particular failures or incompetence, but from natural evolutionary processes following Rome's collapse. A new European order optimized for internal stability rather than external defense. As the 7th century drew to close, these transformational processes continued reshaping European society into forms that would eventually prove both tempting and vulnerable to Norse expansion. In the isolated north, occasional travelers and traders brought tales of southern wealth, political changes, and religious transformations. The increasing contrast between modest Norse resources and growing Frankish, Anglo-Saxon, and Celtic prosperity created economic disparity visible even through limited contact. This widening gap between northern scarcity and southern abundance set conditions for the remarkable explosion of Norse energy that would soon reshape the European world. The stage was set for a dramatic convergence of forces. In the north, environmental pressures, social evolution, and technological innovation were creating a uniquely capable maritime culture with limited economic opportunities at home. Meanwhile, across the wider European world, political consolidation had concentrated unprecedented wealth, while simultaneously creating defensive vulnerabilities through religious transformation and military specialization. These parallel developments would soon connect with explosive consequences when Norse society's internal pressures found release through the external opportunities created by European transformation. The people of the North, shaped by their harsh homeland, guided by their complex mythology, organized through their distinctive social structures, and equipped by their skilled craftsmen, stood poised at history's threshold. When they finally crossed it, the European world would never be the same again. The Viking Age awaited its catalyzing spark. As the 8th century dawned across Scandinavia, a convergence of forces began generating unprecedented pressure within Norse society. These mounting tensions would eventually find release through one of history's most remarkable periods of expansion, transforming not only the North, but much of the European world beyond. The awakening of Norse expansionary energy resulted not from single cause, but from complex interplay of demographic, environmental, political, and technological factors, each contributing to the building pressure that would eventually break through geographical isolation. Population growth strained the limited agricultural capacity of the northern lands with increasing severity. Archaeological evidence reveals expanding settlements, division of previously unified farmsteads, and cultivation of increasingly marginal lands during this period. The Norse population, having adapted successfully to their challenging environment, now found itself victim of its own success. Farmsteads that had comfortably supported single families for generations required subdivision among multiple heirs, reducing each portion below viable subsistence threshold. Communities that had maintained careful balance with local resources found that equilibrium increasingly difficult to maintain, as each generation added more mouths to feed on the same limited, arable land. The inheritance customs of Norse society inadvertently contributed to social instability by creating a class of landless young men with few prospects at home. Under traditional practice, property generally passed undivided to the eldest son, preventing dangerous fragmentation of already modest farmsteads. This pragmatic approach to land succession, while preserving economic viability of individual farms, created systemic problem by leaving younger sons without inheritance. These dispossessed young men, raised with martial skills and Norse values, emphasizing active pursuit of reputation and wealth, represented volatile social element with powerful incentive to seek opportunity elsewhere when domestic options narrowed. Environmental factors temporarily alleviated some pressure, while simultaneously enabling eventual expansionary solution. The medieval warm period, beginning around 700 AD, brought slightly higher temperatures to northern Europe, extending growing seasons and enhancing agricultural productivity. This climatic shift allowed temporary accommodation of growing population, but also critically opened northern seas to more extensive navigation by reducing ice coverage and severe storm frequency. The warming climate made longer sea voyages more predictable and less dangerous precisely when Norse society needed external outlets for internal pressure, creating essential precondition for maritime expansion. Political consolidation occurring across Scandinavia during this period added another dimension to building pressure. The early 8th century witnessed gradual emergence of more powerful regional kings attempting to extend authority over previously independent chieftains and their territories. In Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, ambitious leaders began processes of centralization that directly threatened traditional independence of local power structures. This political evolution generated both push factors, as displaced chieftains sought new territories beyond emerging kings' reach, and organizational capacity, as competing power centers developed capabilities to organize and equip significant expeditionary forces. Economic stratification increasingly divided Norse society between established landholders and marginalized groups lacking secure resource access. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals growing wealth disparity, visible in burial goods, housing quality, and material possessions. This economic differentiation created powerful incentives for disadvantaged groups to seek opportunity through external ventures, while simultaneously providing wealthier elements with capital to fund such expeditions. The emerging economic hierarchy, thus paradoxically, both generated expansionary pressure and provided means to act upon it through investment in ships and equipment that individual actors could not have financed independently. Religious and cultural factors further contributed to the building pressure. Traditional Norse values emphasized active pursuit of reputation through measurable achievement rather than passive acceptance of inherited status. The path to social recognition required demonstration of exceptional capability, particularly for those not born to wealth or position. As domestic opportunities for distinction narrowed with population density and political consolidation, ambitious individuals naturally oriented toward external arenas for proving their worth. The Norse cultural emphasis on reputation building created psychological imperative, complementing material pressures driving eventual expansion. Trade limitations heightened economic frustration as awareness of external wealth grew while access remained constrained. Limited contact with wider European networks had exposed Norse society to desirable goods and materials unavailable domestically, generating demand without corresponding opportunity for satisfaction through peaceful exchange. As continental and British powers developed more organized trading systems, Norse merchants found themselves disadvantaged by their peripheral position and limited production of goods valued in southern markets. This commercial marginalization created economic incentive for more direct appropriation methods when opportunities presented themselves. Technological developments occurring over previous generations had quietly created capabilities, awaiting application to new challenges. Metalworking techniques had improved to produce more effective weapons. Navigational knowledge had expanded through Baltic trade ventures. Most significantly, shipbuilding had evolved significantly from earlier forms, though the revolutionary developments enabling true maritime expansion remained just over the horizon. The combination of building pressure and growing capability created volatile mixture awaiting catalysts to transform potential energy into dramatic action. Reports of political fragmentation and wealth concentration elsewhere in Northern Europe filtered back to Scandinavia through occasional travelers, traders, and mercenaries. These accounts described prosperous yet vulnerable communities whose defenses focused on land-based threats rather than seaborne attack. Such intelligence provided both incentive and strategic guidance for Norse groups considering external opportunities. The growing gap between northern scarcity and southern abundance became increasingly visible precisely when Norse society developed both motivation and means to address this disparity through direct action. By mid-8th century, these converging pressures had created situation awaiting transformative release. The Norse people, constrained by geography, yet possessed of growing capabilities, faced intensifying competition for limited domestic resources. Each factor alone might have produced only incremental change, but their convergence generated revolutionary potential. The pressure building in the north would eventually find expression through the maritime technological revolution, already beginning to take shape along Scandinavian shores. No single factor proved more decisive in enabling Norse expansion than the remarkable evolution in shipbuilding that occurred during the 8th century. This technological revolution transformed limited coastal vessels into the legendary longships capable of unprecedented maritime versatility. The development of these extraordinary craft represented not sudden invention, but culmination of generations of incremental improvement, driven by practical necessity and enabled by exceptional craftsmanship. When complete, this maritime innovation would provide the essential tool that converted Norse potential energy into history-altering kinetic force. The evolution of Norse shipbuilding originated in the simple vessels that had served coastal communities for centuries. These early craft, clinker-built boats with overlapping planks secured to internal frames, provided adequate transportation for local fishing and limited trading voyages, but lacked capabilities necessary for more ambitious journeys. Typically propelled by oars alone, their limited range, capacity, and seaworthiness constrained Norse mobility to familiar waters under favorable conditions. These ancestral craft, nonetheless, contained fundamental DNA of later developments in their basic construction methods and design principles. The revolutionary breakthrough transforming Norse maritime capability centered on a seemingly modest innovation with profound implications: the keel. This structural backbone, running lengthwise beneath the hull, dramatically enhanced stability in rough seas, while enabling more efficient sailing performance. The transition from flat-bottomed or minimally keeled vessels to ships with pronounced, carefully shaped keels represented quantum leap in seafaring capability. A properly designed keel counteracted lateral movement through water, allowing vessel to maintain course rather than simply drifting downwind. This critical innovation transformed ships from coastal conveniences into true ocean-going vessels capable of deliberate navigation across open water. Complementing this central innovation, Norse shipwrights refined the clinker-built construction technique to perfection during this period. This method, where each hull plank overlapped the one below and attached with iron rivets to internal frames, created vessels with extraordinary combination of strength and flexibility. Unlike Mediterranean ships built with planks fitted edge to edge, clinker-built Norse vessels could flex with wave action rather than fighting against it, allowing construction of lighter craft that remained remarkably seaworthy. The resulting hull design provided ideal balance of structural integrity and weight efficiency, essential for vessels needing to perform across widely varying conditions. Sail technology, adapted and refined from earlier contact with sailing cultures around the North Sea, added crucial propulsion capability, enabling truly revolutionary range extension. Archaeological evidence suggests gradual transition from primarily oar-driven vessels to hybrid craft, capable of exploiting both human and wind power according to conditions. The distinctive square sail that characterized Norse vessels provided impressive power when running before favorable winds, while remaining simple enough for relatively easy handling. This dual propulsion capability, oars for precise maneuvering or windless conditions, sail for efficient long-distance travel, granted Norse vessels operational flexibility unmatched by contemporary European shipping. The marriage of these innovations produced the iconic longship, perhaps the most versatile seagoing vessel of the pre-modern era. With length-to-beam ratios of 7:1 or greater, these slender craft achieved remarkable speed while maintaining essential seaworthiness. Their shallow draft allowed navigation far up rivers inaccessible to deeper-keeled vessels. Their lightweight enabled portaging across land when necessary. Their clinker construction provided necessary flexibility for open ocean, while remaining strong enough to survive heavy seas. Most significantly, their hybrid propulsion systems allowed exploitation of favorable conditions, while providing alternatives when nature proved uncooperative. These vessels effectively erased traditional boundaries between rivercraft and seagoing ships, creating maritime platform suited to Norse operating model of coastal raiding, riverine penetration, and open water transit. Beyond these technical innovations, Norse vessels incorporated practical adaptations to northern conditions that enhanced their efficiency. Rowing benches doubled as sleeping platforms during extended voyages. Modular construction allowed partial disassembly for winter storage or overland transport. Removable masts facilitated transition between sailing and rowing configurations according to tactical requirements. Waterproof sailcloth coverings provided shelter during overnight stops or foul weather. These practical features reflected the Norse pragmatic approach to design, where theoretical perfection mattered less than functional versatility under actual operating conditions. Different ship types emerged for specialized purposes as Norse maritime expertise developed. The Kaavi, smallest of the warships, carried perhaps 20 crew members and served for coastal operations. The Snekja, with 30 to 40 oarsmen, represented the standard military vessel for mid-range expeditions. The Skade, measuring up to 30 meters with 60 or more crew, provided platform for major military operations. For trading purposes, the Nar sacrificed speed for cargo capacity, with broader beam and deeper draft optimized for carrying goods rather than warriors. This diversification reflected growing sophistication in Norse maritime operations, with vessel types optimized for specific missions rather than general-purpose craft pressed into varied service. Navigation techniques evolved alongside vessel design to enable increasingly ambitious voyages. Norse sailors developed remarkably effective methods for orientation, despite lacking magnetic compass or sophisticated astronomical instruments. Sunstones, crystals capable of detecting polarized light, even through cloud cover, allowed determination of sun position in challenging visibility. Star patterns, particularly Polaris, provided reliable northerly reference during clear nights. Observation of bird behavior, watercolor, cloud formations, and floating vegetation helped identify proximity to land. Most fundamentally, accumulated knowledge passed between generations of sailors created mental charts of currents, landmarks, and routes more sophisticated than any physical maps of the period. This navigational expertise transformed improved vessels from mere technological possibility into practical tools for unprecedented expansion. Life aboard these revolutionary vessels hardly offered luxury, despite their superior design. Space constraints meant each crew member received approximately 70 centimeters of bench space for both rowing and sleeping. Protection from elements remained minimal, with most vessels open to sky except for limited sailcloth coverings. Food consisted primarily of dried meat, hard bread, and whatever could be obtained ashore during stops. Fresh water presented constant logistical challenge, limiting voyage duration between landfalls. During rowing phases, crew members maintained grueling pace, with each man pulling oar, weighing approximately 5 kilograms through endless repetitive strokes. These harsh conditions demanded exceptional hardiness from crew members, while simultaneously strengthening bonds forged through shared hardship. The construction of these vessels represented significant investment of resources and expertise. A typical longship required hundreds of carefully selected oak trees, thousands of iron rivets, specialized textiles for sails, and countless hours of skilled labor. Such investments exceeded capabilities of individual families, requiring collective effort coordinated by wealthy chieftains or consensus of substantial communities. The economic commitment embodied in these vessels helps explain their careful maintenance, winter storage practices, and prominent role in both practical usage and symbolic representation. Norse ships transcended mere transportation devices to become community assets, embodying collective identity and capability. By the late 8th century, this shipbuilding revolution had reached critical maturity, providing Norse society with unprecedented mobility precisely when internal pressures created powerful expansion incentives. The vessels that took shape along Scandinavian shores during this period would soon transform European history by erasing traditional defensive assumptions based on geographic barriers. Rivers that had served as natural boundaries became highways for Norse penetration. Coastal monasteries that had relied on isolation for protection found themselves suddenly vulnerable. Island communities that had considered themselves safe from mainland threats discovered their security illusory. The technological revolution in Norse shipbuilding had rewritten maritime possibility, creating capabilities that would shortly find expression in dramatic fashion across European shores. While revolutionary ships provided essential platforms for Norse expansion, the effectiveness of that expansion ultimately depended on the warriors who manned those vessels and the weapons they wielded. During the decades preceding outward explosion, significant developments in Norse martial culture laid groundwork for the military effectiveness that would soon astonish European contemporaries. This martial evolution involved not only technological refinements in weaponry, but also cultural and organizational developments that transformed fighting capability from simple tribal defense into sophisticated offensive capacity. The Norse warrior tradition originated in practical defensive necessity rather than militaristic ideology. Early Scandinavian communities required all able-bodied men to defend family and property against external threats, ranging from animal predators to human competitors. This universal participation in community defense meant basic weapon skills formed part of standard male education rather than specialized professional training. Young men learned weapon handling alongside farming techniques, fishing methods, and other essential skills as integrated aspect of normal development. This broad-based martial foundation meant Norse society could mobilize remarkably high percentage of adult male population for military purposes when required. Unlike more stratified societies, where weapons training remained restricted to dedicated warrior class, weapons themselves evolved from simple farming implements into specialized tools of war through gradual refinement. The axe, originally essential forestry and carpentry tool, developed into distinctively Norse weapon through subtle modification. By extending the blade and reducing weight, craftsmen transformed utilitarian implement into devastating weapon, capable of penetrating armor or shields with relatively modest training. The spear, similarly evolved from hunting tool, provided effective standoff capability while requiring minimal metal compared to swords. These weapon evolutions reflected pragmatic Norse approach to military technology, prioritizing effectiveness, affordability, and versatility over specialized combat optimization, requiring extensive training or resource commitment. The iconic Viking swords represented more specialized and prestigious development in Norse weaponry. Unlike more democratic axe and spear, swords required substantial resources and sophisticated metalworking techniques. Early Norse swords often originated as imports from Frankish territories, where bladesmithing traditions had maintained greater continuity with Roman methods. By the 8th century, however, Norse smiths had begun mastering pattern welding techniques that combined iron strips of varying carbon content to produce blades with both hardness for edge retention and flexibility for structural integrity. These sophisticated weapons, typically reserved for chieftains and wealthy warriors, became not merely tools, but status symbols whose craftsmanship and decoration reflected owners' social standing. Defensive equipment, similarly, balanced practical effectiveness against resource constraints. The round shield emerged as signature Norse defensive tool, constructed from planks with iron rim and central boss protecting hand grip. These relatively light shields could actively deflect incoming attacks rather than merely absorbing them, allowing mobility advantages crucial in both individual combat and group tactics. Body armor remained relatively rare compared to contemporary military forces elsewhere in Europe, with wealthy warriors sometimes possessing mail shirts, while common fighters relied primarily on heavy clothing, leather, or no body protection beyond shields. This equipment profile reflected Norse tactical emphasis on mobility, aggression, and offensive action, rather than attrition warfare or defensive stand. Training for combat began early in Norse life, through combination of practical necessity and cultural values. Young boys practiced with wooden weapons, engaged in physical competitions, developing required attributes, and absorbed martial values through stories recounted during long winter evenings. Formal weapon training typically began around age 12, when physical development permitted effective handling of actual weapons. Unlike specialized military training in contemporary professional forces, Norse martial education remained integrated with broader life skills, producing versatile fighters capable of extended self-sufficiency during campaigns, rather than specialized soldiers dependent on complex logistical support. This practical training approach proved particularly suited to the expeditionary warfare that would characterize Viking operations. Shield wall tactics emerged during this period as signature Norse fighting formation, demonstrating growing sophistication in group combat methods. This technique, where warriors formed continuous barrier of overlapping shields, transformed individual fighters into cohesive combat unit, capable of withstanding superior numbers or cavalry charges. The formation required discipline and practice to maintain under combat stress, but provided defensive solidity from which individual warriors could strike opportunistically at opponents. The shield wall represented significant development beyond earlier tribal fighting methods, showing Norse capacity for tactical innovation and group coordination that would prove decisive in coming conflicts against often disorganized opposition. Leadership structures within emerging warrior bands reflected distinctive Norse approach to authority and organization. Unlike hierarchical military systems elsewhere in Europe, Norse warbands operated through combination of recognized fighting prowess, demonstrated success, and proven judgment rather than formal rank or noble birth. Leaders needed to demonstrate personal courage alongside tactical acumen, fighting among their men rather than commanding from safe distance. This leadership model created a meritocratic system where effectiveness rather than heritage determined command authority, producing military organizations remarkably responsive to changing conditions and opponent weaknesses. The resulting command flexibility would prove significant advantage in coming decades of opportunistic raiding against more rigidly organized opponents. The berserker phenomenon, often misunderstood in popular imagination, represented specialized element within Norse martial culture rather than its foundation. These elite warriors, allegedly fighting in battle frenzy without normal human limitations, occupied ambiguous position between military asset and potentially dangerous liability. Historical evidence suggests berserkers formed minority among Norse fighters, possibly cultivating fearsome reputation through combination of psychological techniques, controlled battle rage, and perhaps mind-altering substances. Their primary value lay in psychological impact upon opponents rather than objective combat advantages. demonstrating Norse understanding of warfare's psychological dimension alongside its physical aspects. This psychological warfare component would later prove significant factor in Norse success against numerically superior but psychologically unprepared opponents. Religious elements intertwined with martial culture, with Odin particularly associated with warfare, victory, and warrior death. The concept of Valhalla, afterlife hall where fallen warriors enjoyed eternal feast and combat, provided powerful motivation transcending mere material gain. Warriors believed dying courageously in battle guaranteed prestigious afterlife, removing natural fear of death that might otherwise constrain fighting commitment. This religious dimension transformed warfare from merely pragmatic activity into sacred opportunity, creating fighters willing to accept extraordinary risks for chance at both earthly reputation and divine recognition. The resulting psychological commitment would give Norse raiders significant advantage against Christian opponents, operating from different motivational framework. By the late 8th century, distinctive Norse warrior culture had emerged from earlier tribal fighting traditions through combination of pragmatic innovation, cultural evolution, and technical development. This martial capability, paired with revolutionary maritime mobility provided by advanced shipbuilding, created unprecedented strategic threat. Highly mobile, psychologically committed fighting forces, able to appear without warning at vulnerable locations chosen specifically for limited defensive preparation. The weapons, tactics, and warrior ethos developed during this formative period would shortly transform from regional defensive capacity into international offensive capability with profound implications for European development. The Norse warriors had been forged by their northern crucible. Soon their fire would spread far beyond Scandinavian shores, while the dramatic raids beginning in 793 AD would introduce Norse expansion to historical consciousness. With shocking suddenness, these famous attacks represented not initiation, but acceleration of process already underway for decades. Throughout the 8th century, Norse horizons gradually expanded through tentative ventures beyond traditional waters. These early expeditions, primarily peaceful trading missions with occasional opportunistic raiding, established knowledge, connections, and patterns that would enable more ambitious operations once proper conditions aligned. The first ventures beyond Scandinavian shores laid essential groundwork for the explosion of activity that historians would later identify as the Viking Age proper. Baltic trade networks provided first significant avenue for Norse exploration beyond immediate coastal waters. Archaeological evidence reveals growing Scandinavian presence in Baltic trading centers like Grobin, Trousseau, and Staraya Ladoga during the 8th century. These eastern ventures connected Norse merchants with trading systems stretching ultimately to Constantinople and Baghdad, bringing exotic goods and unprecedented wealth back to northern communities. Particularly valuable commodities flowed through these networks. Arabic silver, Byzantine silk, exotic spices, and fine weapons found eager markets among increasingly sophisticated Norse elites. These Eastern commercial connections demonstrated economic possibilities beyond traditional subsistence activities, while developing navigational knowledge and maritime experience essential for later expansion. Contact with Frisian merchants along North Sea coasts introduced Norse traders to commercial networks spanning the Channel to Britain and south to the Rhine Delta. These interactions provided not only trading opportunities, but intelligence regarding wealth and defenses of lands beyond immediate experience. Frisian traders, functioning as middlemen between Scandinavian and Frankish territories, inadvertently transmitted crucial information about political situations, settlement patterns, and vulnerable targets throughout northwestern Europe. The resulting knowledge allowed Norse leaders to identify promising opportunities with remarkable strategic clarity once conditions favored more direct intervention. Initial contacts with Anglo-Saxon England likely occurred through limited trading missions to coastal markets. Archaeological evidence from sites like Hamwick, Southampton, Ipswich, and York shows Scandinavian goods appearing in English contexts before historical records mention Viking activity. These early commercial ventures, while modest in scale, familiarized Norse merchants with England's geography, wealth, and defensive arrangements. Particularly significant intelligence gathered during these interactions concerned the locations and riches of English monasteries, institutions whose wealth, concentration, and limited defensive capability would make them primary targets once Norse expansion turned from commerce to acquisition by force. Early intelligence gathering extended beyond mere observation to active reconnaissance. Norse visitors to foreign shores carefully noted defensive arrangements, political disputes, settlement patterns, and wealth distribution. This information returned north to interested parties planning more ambitious ventures. The thoroughness of this reconnaissance explains the remarkable strategic sophistication displayed in early Viking raids, which consistently targeted vulnerable yet wealthy locations, with precision indicating detailed advance knowledge. The Norse proved exceptionally adept at identifying political weaknesses, exploiting religious vulnerabilities, and capitalizing on infrastructural limitations of potential targets through patient information, gathering preceding direct action. Small-scale coastal raids likely occurred decades before famous Lindisfarne attack, though historical records mention these only obliquely due to their limited scale and focus on less historically visible targets. These tentative operations, targeting isolated farms, fishing villages, or minor trading settlements, tested potential resistance while providing valuable experience in amphibious operations. Such limited ventures allowed Norse raiders to develop tactical methods, assess defensive responses, and perfect operational techniques without attracting organized opposition from larger political entities. This approach reflected characteristic Norse pragmatism, gradually building capability through incremental experience, rather than risking catastrophic failure through premature ambition. Participation in foreign mercenary activity provided another avenue for expanding Norse horizons and gathering valuable intelligence. Historical sources occasionally mention Scandinavian warriors serving various European powers during the 8th century, particularly along dynamic frontier regions. These experiences exposed Norse fighters to foreign military techniques, political situations, and potential vulnerabilities, while simultaneously developing combat skills applicable to later independent operations. Perhaps most significantly, mercenary service demonstrated the potential wealth available through military activity compared to traditional subsistence pursuits, creating powerful incentive for redirecting Norse martial capacity toward external opportunities once conditions permitted. Seasonal patterns began emerging during these early ventures that would characterize later Viking operations. Spring departures from Scandinavian harbors allowed exploitation of favorable summer sailing conditions while leaving participants home for autumn harvest activities. This timing minimized risk to community subsistence while maximizing potential for successful expeditions. The resulting operational calendar, planning during winter, preparation in early spring, execution through summer, return for harvest, synchronized Norse expansion with agricultural requirements, allowing simultaneous pursuit of traditional subsistence alongside new external opportunities. This balance helped manage transition from purely agricultural society to one incorporating significant maritime expeditionary component. Word of successful ventures, whether commercial or occasional raiding, spread rapidly through Norse communities, generating interest in further opportunities. The highly oral culture efficiently transmitted reports of foreign wealth, vulnerability, and opportunity through winter feasting halls where communities gathered during long northern nights. Stories recounting successful traders returning with exotic goods or fortunate raiders carrying foreign treasure created powerful demonstration effect, particularly for younger men facing limited domestic prospects. This social transmission mechanism accelerated adoption of expansionary activities by rapidly disseminating both incentive and practical knowledge throughout Norse society. The 8th century witnessed significant Norse population appearing in Orkney and Shetland Islands, establishing advanced bases that would later facilitate deeper penetration into British territories. These northern islands, relatively close to Scandinavian shores and sparsely populated by Pictish inhabitants, offered ideal stepping stones for gradual expansion westward. Control of these strategic locations provided safe harbours, supply points, and winter quarters for vessels operating beyond range of direct return to Scandinavia. This gradual establishment of forward operating locations demonstrated sophisticated long-term strategic thinking, rather than merely opportunistic raiding, suggesting conscious expansion strategy, rather than random opportunism. By the late 8th century, critical mass of experience, intelligence, capability, and motivation had accumulated within Norse society regarding external opportunities. Improved vessels provided necessary transportation capacity. Developed weapons and tactics ensured military effectiveness. Reconnaissance had identified vulnerable yet valuable targets. Forward bases had been established at strategic locations. Most importantly, growing numbers of Norse individuals, particularly ambitious young men with limited domestic prospects, had concluded that greater opportunity existed beyond traditional territories than within them. This convergence of capability and motivation needed only catalyst to transform potential into action. That catalyst would arrive in 793 AD on the holy island of Lindisfarne, when accumulating Norse pressure finally found dramatic release that would transform European history. The closing decades of the 8th century witnessed final alignment of conditions that would transform Norse expansion from limited probes into history-altering phenomenon. Technological, social, and intelligence factors had created explosive potential, requiring only appropriate spark to ignite dramatic release of Norse energy. That spark would materialize through combination of specific opportunity recognition and operational capability, culminating in the famous Lindisfarne raid that traditionally marks Viking Age commencement. This transitional period reveals how accumulating pressure, once provided viable outlet, rapidly accelerates from isolated incidents into self-reinforcing historical process. Political fragmentation across potential target territories created strategic opportunity increasingly visible to Norse leaders evaluating external prospects. England had divided into competing kingdoms: Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, East Anglia, Kent, and others, whose rivalries prevented unified defense against external threats. The Frankish Empire under Charlemagne, while powerful on continental scale, struggled to protect its extensive coastline against mobile maritime raiders. Ireland's division into numerous petty kingdoms ensured that any resistance would remain localized rather than coordinated. This fragmentation meant Norse expeditionary forces could select isolated targets whose local defenders would receive minimal external support, allowing raiders to concentrate superior force at vulnerable points before withdrawing ahead of any larger response. Defenseless monasteries presented particularly attractive targets as Norse reconnaissance identified their unique vulnerability profile. These religious communities, deliberately established in isolated locations to facilitate spiritual contemplation, typically lacked significant defensive capabilities while housing extraordinary wealth concentration. Their locations, often on islands, peninsulas, or coastal sites chosen for seclusion rather than defensibility, made them perfectly suited to Norse amphibious operational model. Moreover, Christian religious ideology discouraged armed resistance while promoting forgiveness toward attackers, creating targets psychologically unprepared for determined assault. Perhaps most significantly, monasteries contained portable wealth specifically designed for easy transport, precisely what efficient raiders required for maximum gain with minimum logistical burden. Among these monastic targets, Lindisfarne held special appeal from Norse operational perspective. This island monastery off England's Northumbrian coast combined several characteristics, making it ideal proving ground for expanded raiding operations. Its island location played perfectly to Norse maritime strength, while limiting potential defensive reinforcement. Its religious significance as centre of Northumbrian Christianity guaranteed exceptional wealth concentration in reliquaries, ceremonial items, and illuminated manuscripts. Its fame would ensure any successful raid generated maximum psychological impact across Christian Europe. Perhaps most importantly, its position near Scottish border placed it in politically ambiguous territory, where response jurisdiction remained unclear, delaying effective counteraction. Intelligence regarding Lindisfarne's riches had likely reached Scandinavian ears through trading contacts, mercenary service, or targeted reconnaissance during preceding decades. Norse merchants operating in nearby ports would have heard accounts of the monastery's treasures, accumulated through royal patronage and religious donations. The reputation of its scriptorium, producing magnificent illuminated manuscripts like the Lindisfarne Gospels, suggested valuable portable objects ideal for rapid seizure. Reports of gold and silver ceremonial items, jeweled reliquaries, and accumulated donations created powerful incentive for raiders evaluating potential targets based on risk-reward calculations. This specific intelligence transformed general opportunity awareness into actionable targeting decision. The assembly of first major raiding party represented significant escalation from earlier small-scale ventures, demonstrating growing organizational capacity within Norse society. Unlike previous limited probes involving single ships or small groups, the Lindisfarne operation required coordination of multiple vessels and dozens of warriors. Such expedition demanded substantial resource commitment, careful planning, and leadership capable of maintaining discipline throughout complex operation. The willingness of significant warrior contingent to participate indicated growing confidence in external opportunity compared to domestic prospects. This organizational milestone demonstrated Norse capacity for operations beyond simple opportunistic raiding, suggesting potential for sustained campaign activity once initial success proved concept viable. Technological readiness had reached critical threshold by this period, with shipbuilding advances creating vessels capable of reliable cross-North Sea voyages while maintaining combat effectiveness upon arrival. The distinctive Norse longships had reached developmental maturity, combining speed, seaworthiness, shallow draft, and dual propulsion capability, essential for successful amphibious raiding. Weapons technology had similarly evolved to provide effective offensive capability with relatively limited resource investment. These technological factors ensured raiders could reach chosen targets reliably, deploy effectively upon arrival, and return safely with acquired wealth. the three essential requirements for sustainable raiding operations that previous generations could not consistently fulfill. Social factors within Scandinavia had created a growing pool of motivated participants for external ventures. Population pressure continuing from previous decades ensured substantial numbers of young men faced limited domestic prospects despite capabilities and ambitions. Political consolidation had displaced formerly independent actors, seeking new arenas for exercise of power and pursuit of wealth. Most significantly, Norse social values, emphasizing reputation through demonstrated achievement, created cultural imperative driving ambitious individuals toward opportunities for distinction. These social dynamics provided essential human capital for expansionary activity precisely when technological capability made such expansion viable. The success of this first major raid would establish template for operations across following decades, demonstrating effective operational model for maritime-based raiding. The attack would confirm vulnerability of religious targets despite their cultural significance and theoretical divine protection. It would validate intelligence-based targeting approach, identifying wealth concentration points with limited defensive capability. Perhaps most importantly, it would reveal psychological vulnerability of Christian communities, unprepared for sudden violence against sacred institutions. These lessons would rapidly disseminate through Norse networks, transforming isolated incident into repeatable operational pattern with revolutionary implications for European security. Most fundamentally, this transitional period witnessed shift from Norse expansion as theoretical possibility to historical reality through conversion of potential energy into kinetic force. The pressure built through preceding decades, demographic, economic, technological, political, had finally found release mechanism through recognition of specific external vulnerability aligned with Norse capability. The resulting ignition would spark chain reaction continuing for centuries, as initial success generated resources, enabling further operations in self-reinforcing cycle. What began as rational response to specific opportunity would evolve into sustained historical process, reshaping European development across multiple dimensions. A new type of warfare, maritime-based raiding, with sophisticated amphibious capability, stood poised to challenge existing European security assumptions built around land-based threats and fixed defensive positions. Unlike previous Germanic migrations involving whole populations seeking settlement, this new Norse approach employed mobile strike forces optimized for wealth acquisition and tactical surprise. European defenses designed to counter traditional threats would prove catastrophically vulnerable to this innovative operational model, combining maritime mobility with precise intelligence and ruthless execution. The resulting asymmetric advantage would persist for decades until defensive adaptations gradually evolved to counter the revolutionary Norse approach. As the spark prepared to ignite in the final years of the 8th century, Europe remained largely unaware of transformational threat gathering beyond northern horizon. Monastery bells rang across Christian lands, calling monks to prayer in communities believing their sacred purpose provided both divine and secular protection. Coastal settlements conducted daily business, assuming geography still provided traditional security buffer. Political leaders focused on conventional threats from neighboring powers rather than potential danger from seemingly remote northern peoples. This complacency would shatter dramatically on June 8th, 793 AD, when longships appeared off Lindisfarne and a new historical era began with bloodshed on holy ground. Dawn broke over the holy island of Lindisfarne on June 8th, 793 AD, much as it had for nearly 2 centuries since Irish monks first established their religious community on this tidal island off the Northumbrian coast. The monastery had flourished into one of Christian Europe's most significant spiritual and cultural centres, its scriptorium producing magnificent illuminated manuscripts, its reliquaries housing sacred remains, its reputation for learning and piety drawing pilgrims from across Britain and beyond. As morning prayers concluded and monks moved to their daily tasks of manuscript copying, gardening, and religious instruction, none suspected that this ordinary day would mark a historical watershed whose ripples would transform European history. The first indication of impending calamity came when sharp-eyed monks noticed unusual sails on the northeastern horizon. The distinctive square sails of Norse vessels, previously uncommon in these waters, approached with deliberate purpose rather than the casual trajectory of trading vessels. As the ships drew closer, their narrow profiles and dragon-headed prows became visible, along with the ominous gleam of weapons and shields along their gunwales. The monastery's warning bell began to toll, summoning all within hearing to seek safety within the stone church or flee inland. For many, the warning came too late. The longships grounded on Lindisfarne's beaches with practiced precision, their shallow drafts allowing them to approach much closer to shore than conventional vessels. From each ship poured several dozen warriors, moving with discipline that belied the common perception of barbarians. Their formation and coordination suggested careful planning rather than impulsive attack. Some warriors immediately established perimeter control to prevent escape, while others moved directly toward the monastery buildings, with evident foreknowledge of the compound's layout. This was no random assault, but carefully orchestrated operation, based on advanced intelligence and clear objectives. The monastery's daily routines shattered into chaos as raiders breached its modest defensive walls. Armed only with simple tools and religious conviction, the monks faced professional warriors equipped with swords, axes, and shields, their bodies hardened by lifetime of physical exertion. Some monks attempted to hide sacred treasures, while others tried reasoning with the invaders, invoking divine protection or offering themselves in place of younger members of the community. These appeals fell on deaf ears. The raiders moved methodically through the complex, securing buildings and collecting valuable items with efficiency, suggesting familiarity with their task. Violence unfolded with shocking intensity as monks who resisted or moved too slowly met brutal ends. Contemporary accounts describe altars splashed with blood, sacred books torn apart for their jeweled bindings, crosses stripped of precious metals, and reliquaries emptied of contents considered worthless by raiders interested only in material value. The psychological impact of such sacrilege, deliberately perpetrated on consecrated ground, magnified the physical terror of the assault. For Christian witnesses, this attack represented not merely physical danger, but spiritual abomination, violence against God himself through desecration of his holy places and servants. Some monks were dragged from hiding places, bound together, and herded toward the waiting ships. These captives represented additional value beyond precious metals and jewels, as the thriving slave markets around the North Sea and beyond paid premium prices for educated Christians who could serve as tutors or skilled laborers. Young, healthy monks would fetch particularly high prices in markets as far away as North Africa and the Middle East. This human commodity, easily transported and self-maintaining until sale, represented significant portion of raiders' anticipated profit from the expedition. While violence dominated the scene, the raiders displayed surprising discipline in their plundering. Rather than random destruction, they focused exclusively on items combining high value with low weight and volume, the optimal parameters for efficient raiding. Gold and silver ceremonial items, jewel-encrusted religious artifacts, and coins received immediate attention, while bulkier treasures were evaluated for worth-to-weight ratio before taking. The raiders even brought scales to assess precious metals, demonstrating commercial sophistication underlying their violent methods. This selective approach maximized return on effort, while minimizing time spent vulnerable on foreign shores. Throughout the assault, Norse commanders maintained strict control over their forces, ensuring the operation proceeded according to plan rather than degenerating into chaotic violence. Whistles, horn blasts, and hand signals coordinated activities between different groups. Designated lookouts maintained vigilance for potential counterattack from mainland. Predetermined assembly points and rally signals ensured raiders could quickly regroup if separated. This tactical discipline directly contradicted European perceptions of northern barbarians as disorganized savages, revealing sophisticated military capability that would confound defenders for decades to come. After several hours of methodical plundering, signal horns called raiders back to their vessels. They departed with same efficiency that marked their arrival, carrying plundered treasure, selected captives, and any useful items that might serve their communities back home. No attempt was made to occupy the site or establish permanent presence. The objective had been resource extraction rather than territorial conquest. As swiftly as they had appeared, the longships slipped back over the horizon, leaving smoking ruins, dead bodies, and profound shock in their wake. For survivors watching from hiding places inland or emerging from concealment after raiders departed, the devastation presented an apocalyptic scene. One eyewitness account describes how the church was spattered with the blood of the priests of God, despoiled of all its ornaments. Beyond physical destruction lay deeper psychological and theological trauma. How could God permit such desecration of sacred space? What sins had the community committed to deserve such divine abandonment? The attack struck not merely at bodies and buildings, but at fundamental Christian understanding of divine protection for those dedicated to religious life. Word of the Lindisfarne atrocity spread rapidly across European Christendom, carried by shocked survivors and amplified by ecclesiastical networks. Alcuin of York, leading scholar at Charlemagne's court, gave voice to the widespread horror in famous letter asking, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God, like dung in the streets." This framing of events as religious catastrophe, rather than merely military defeat, established interpretive framework that would shape European understanding of Norse expansion for centuries. The Lindisfarne raid succeeded beyond raiders' likely expectations, not merely in material acquisition, but in psychological impact. The attack demonstrated vulnerability of previously secure locations, revealed defensive inadequacy of existing arrangements, and identified rich targets largely unprotected by conventional military forces. Most importantly, it established operational template that could be replicated elsewhere. Maritime approach to isolated wealthy target, rapid execution of well-planned assault, and swift withdrawal before effective response could materialize. This model would prove devastatingly effective against European coastal infrastructure designed for different threat parameters. In historical perspective, the Lindisfarne raid represents perfect storm of Norse capability meeting European vulnerability. The raiders possessed vessels capable of delivering strike force precisely where defenses were weakest. They had developed weapons and tactics optimized for rapid assault, rather than pitched battle or siege operations. Their intelligence gathering had identified target combining maximum wealth with minimum protection. Perhaps most significantly, they operated from motivational framework unrestrained by Christian ethical prohibitions against attacking religious targets, while their victims struggled to comprehend violence unconstrained by shared cultural values. Yet Lindisfarne itself, though traditionally marked as Viking Age commencement, constituted merely opening move in much larger historical process. What distinguished this attack from earlier limited probes was not the method, but the scale, sophistication, and most importantly, the consequences. The success at Lindisfarne guaranteed similar operations would follow, creating self-reinforcing cycle, wherein each successful raid generated resources enabling further expansion. The plunder taken from Lindisfarne would finance additional ships, equip more warriors, and attract new participants to subsequent ventures. Europe's nightmare had only begun. The shocking success of the Lindisfarne raid and subsequent attacks stemmed not merely from Norse courage or European unpreparedness, but from deadly effectiveness of Viking weapons, tactics, and psychological operations. The raiders who descended upon European shores brought with them sophisticated martial system optimized for their unique operational model. Understanding these weapons of terror, both physical and psychological, reveals how numerically modest Norse forces generated impact vastly disproportionate to their numbers, transforming European security paradigms within single generation. Psychological impact of surprise attacks constituted perhaps the most potent weapon in the Norse arsenal. European defense thinking had evolved to counter known threats, land-based armies approaching along predictable routes, announcing their intentions through visible movement of large forces. Against this anticipated pattern, Norse raiders presented fundamentally different challenge by appearing without warning at vulnerable locations explicitly selected for their unpreparedness. Witnesses described lightning from the north and ships appearing as if by dark magic when trying to convey the psychological shock of these unanticipated assaults. This surprise advantage multiplied Norse combat effectiveness by denying defenders time to organize resistance, gather reinforcements, or even psychologically prepare for combat. Speed and mobility provided tactical advantages no less decisive than surprise. Norse longships could cover 60 nautical miles daily under favorable conditions, allowing raiders to strike targets far from their previous location within time frame that defied contemporary expectations of military movement. Once ashore, Norse warriors moved quickly unburdened by heavy armor or cumbersome supply trains. This operational tempo created fundamental asymmetry. Raiders could concentrate forces against isolated target, complete their mission, and withdraw before defenders could likewise concentrate sufficient response. European defensive systems, designed for slower-moving threats, found themselves consistently reactive rather than proactive, perpetually arriving after attackers had departed. The Norse weapons themselves, while not technologically superior to contemporary European arms, perfectly complemented their fighting style and operational methods. Chief among these, the iconic Viking axe represented ideal raid weapon through its versatility, efficiency, and psychological impact. With broad cutting edge and concentrated weight toward the head, these axes could penetrate mail armor, shatter shields, or breach wooden doors with terrifying effectiveness. Unlike swords requiring extensive training for effective use, axes leveraged natural human understanding of chopping motion, allowing even modestly trained warriors to inflict devastating damage. The distinctive overhead swing, gathering momentum before devastating impact, became signature motion, striking terror into Christian witnesses unaccustomed to such ferocity. For elite warriors and leaders, pattern-welded swords represented height of Norse weapons technology and status symbols reflecting owners' wealth and standing. These sophisticated blades combined multiple types of iron: soft, flexible, low-carbon iron for core flexibility with high-carbon steel edges for cutting performance, forge welded into single weapon, offering optimal performance characteristics. Such swords required significant resources and specialized craftsmanship, limiting their distribution primarily to wealthy chieftains and prominent warriors. The prestige of these weapons extended beyond practical application, with names, histories, and sometimes runic inscriptions enhancing their mystique. For Europeans facing these exceptional weapons wielded by skilled opponents, the technological sophistication directly contradicted perception of northern barbarians. Spears provided standard armament for majority of Norse warriors, combining combat effectiveness with resource efficiency. Requiring minimal metal for lethal tip while utilizing wooden shaft for reach, spears allowed equipping large forces without extensive iron resources. In combat, spears offered versatility through both thrusting and throwing options, allowing warriors to engage opponents at various distances according to tactical situation. During ship landings, spears allowed establishing defensive perimeter quickly, while more specialized forces moved toward primary objectives. The psychological impact of spear walls advancing methodically toward defenders contributed significantly to Norse battlefield dominance, particularly against hastily assembled opposition unaccustomed to disciplined formation fighting. Defensive equipment for Norse warriors balanced protection against mobility requirements essential to their operational model. The round shield, typically 75 to 90 centimeters in diameter, with iron boss protecting the hand grip, served as primary defense. These shields, constructed from planks rather than single piece of wood, provided superior strength while remaining light enough for prolonged combat use. Norse shield techniques emphasized active defense, parrying, deflecting, or even shield punching, rather than passive barrier role. This dynamic defensive style maintained mobility advantage crucial to raid operations, where speed often determined success or failure, more than individual combat prowess. Body armor remained relatively uncommon among Norse forces compared to contemporary professional armies elsewhere in Europe. Mail shirts, composed of thousands of interlocking iron rings, provided excellent protection, but required substantial resources to produce and imposed significant weight penalty on wearers. Consequently, such armor remained limited primarily to chieftains and wealthy warriors, with majority of raiders relying on shields alone for protection. This apparent vulnerability actually supported Norse operational doctrine, emphasizing speed, surprise, and mobility over attrition warfare. By sacrificing heavy protection, raiders maintained crucial movement advantages that consistently allowed them to dictate terms of engagement rather than respond to enemy initiatives. The controversial berserker phenomenon represented specialized aspect of Norse military operations rather than standard practice. These warriors, allegedly fighting in trance-like state with superhuman strength and immunity to pain, likely combined psychological conditioning, possible use of mind-altering substances, and deliberate cultivation of fearsome reputation to create battlefield impact exceeding their actual numbers. While modern scholarship questions most extreme accounts of berserker behavior, contemporary sources consistently mention these distinctive warriors with mixture of fascination and terror. Their primary value lay in psychological impact upon opponents and inspirational effect upon fellow warriors rather than tactical advantages alone. Helmets, contrary to popular imagination, rarely featured horns, but instead emphasized practical protection through conical or rounded designs with nasal guards. Archaeological evidence suggests helmets remained relatively uncommon, again reflecting Norse preference for mobility over maximum protection. The distinctive spectacle helmet, with eye protection, appears occasionally in archaeological record, but never in quantities suggesting standard issue. Like mail armor, helmets typically indicated elite status within raiding party, rather than standard equipment for all participants. This equipment profile, limited armor concentrated among leadership, optimized raiding forces for rapid movement while maintaining sufficient protected elements to provide tactical core when needed. Beyond physical weapons, Norse raiders employed sophisticated psychological warfare techniques, amplifying their effectiveness. Deliberate targeting of religious sites exploited Christian theological vulnerabilities, creating crisis of faith alongside physical damages. Theatrical displays of violence, sometimes including ritual killings with religious overtones, generated terror disproportionate to actual casualties. Distinctive animal head prow ornaments on longships created frightening silhouettes, triggering immediate panic among coastal populations. Even language barriers enhanced psychological impact, as victims could not negotiate or reason with attackers speaking unintelligible tongue and operating from different cultural framework. The synthesis of these physical and psychological weapons created military capability perfectly adapted to exploit European vulnerabilities of the period. Norse raiders could appear without warning, strike with devastating effectiveness before effective response mobilized, and disappear with equal rapidity, carrying away portable wealth while leaving psychological trauma that discouraged pursuit. This operational model, proven effective at Lindisfarne, would be replicated with devastating success across European coastlines in coming decades. The weapons of terror had drawn first blood, and European defenses had no immediate answer to this revolutionary threat suddenly materialized from the northern horizon. The completion of successful raids marked not conclusion, but midpoint of Viking expeditionary cycles. As attention shifted from execution to extraction of maximum value from acquired resources, the journey home and subsequent distribution of plunder played crucial role in sustaining and expanding Norse raiding activities by converting raw success into systematized rewards. This phase transformed one-time raids into self-reinforcing economic system that would power Norse expansion for generations. Understanding this return and reward cycle reveals how Viking activities evolved from opportunistic incidents into sustained historical phenomenon, reshaping European development. The journey home across often treacherous North Sea represented significant challenge even for accomplished Norse mariners. Vessels heavy with plunder and possibly captives required careful handling, especially as autumn weather patterns increased maritime hazards. Navigation relied on accumulated knowledge passed between generations, with landmarks, star positions, and natural indicators guiding vessels back toward familiar shores. This return voyage often proved more dangerous than outbound journey, as weather conditions might deteriorate unexpectedly or pursuit forces might intercept raiders before they reached friendly territory. The successful completion of this challenging transit represented substantial achievement beyond the raid itself. Upon reaching home shores, the division of spoils followed strict Norse custom, ensuring equitable distribution according to established formulas. Historical sources and archaeological evidence suggest systematic approach rather than arbitrary allocation. Ship owners typically received larger shares, reflecting their capital investment in the essential vessel. Expedition leaders claimed predetermined portion, recognizing their organizational contribution and risk acceptance. Individual warriors received shares proportionate to their participation and demonstrated effectiveness. Even crew members who had remained with ships during active raiding received allocated portion, acknowledging their essential support role. This systematic distribution maintained social cohesion while creating transparent incentive structure, encouraging future participation. The material rewards from successful raids varied widely, but potentially represented life-changing wealth for participants by standards of their resource-constrained homeland. Silver items, communion vessels, reliquaries, decorative items, held particular value as they could be melted down for direct use or exchange. Ecclesiastical treasures, while created for spiritual purposes, contained substantial precious metal easily convertible to secular use. Illuminated manuscripts, though spiritually worthless to pagan raiders, yielded valuable materials when bindings were stripped of jewels and gold decoration. Most valuable of all, coins required no processing whatsoever, representing immediately usable wealth. Archaeological evidence from Norse burial sites increasingly includes such foreign treasures as raid activity intensified, demonstrating direct connection between external acquisition and domestic wealth accumulation. Human captives constituted particularly valuable commodity from successful raids, especially those with specialized skills or education. Christian monks, trained in literacy and various crafts, commanded premium prices in slave markets around North Sea and beyond. Young women taken during raids faced particularly harsh fate in societies where gender imbalances created strong demand for female slaves, both as domestic servants and concubines. The slave-taking aspect of Norse raids, while less emphasized in popular imagination than treasure acquisition, represented significant economic component of overall raiding model. Contemporary accounts emphasize the trauma of families separated through this practice, with particular horror expressed over enslavement of individuals previously dedicated to religious life. The successful raiders enjoyed substantial status enhancement upon return, their new wealth translating directly into social standing within Norse communities. Silver arm rings, imported weapons, exotic clothing, and other visible markers of raiding success served as powerful advertisements of individual accomplishment. In society where reputation depended heavily on demonstrated achievement rather than inherited position, these physical manifestations of successful raiding directly elevated social standing. Young men previously occupying marginal positions could rapidly ascend social hierarchy through raid participation, gaining marriage opportunities, political influence, and community respect previously unattainable. This social mobility aspect helps explain the enthusiastic adoption of raiding activity across Norse society once its effectiveness had been demonstrated. Winter feasting halls provided crucial venues where successful expeditions transformed from individual achievement into community narrative. During long northern nights, accomplished raiders recounted their adventures to eager audiences, transmitting practical knowledge alongside entertaining stories. These accounts, enhanced through natural storytelling embellishment, spread awareness of opportunities, methods, and potential rewards throughout Norse communities. Young men listening to these tales could visualize themselves achieving similar success, creating powerful recruitment mechanism for subsequent expeditions. The oral tradition thus served dual purpose: entertainment during harsh winter, while simultaneously disseminating essential intelligence and operational knowledge supporting continued expansion. The tangible success of early raiders created powerful demonstration effect, motivating increased participation in subsequent seasons. Archaeological evidence shows dramatic increase in ship construction following initial successful raids, as communities invested resources in vessels, enabling participation in this promising new economic activity. Previously skeptical individuals having witnessed neighbors returning with unprecedented wealth, eagerly volunteered for next year's voyages. Chieftains, who might initially have questioned raiding wisdom, now competed to organize expeditions, recognizing opportunity to enhance both personal wealth and political standing through successful leadership. This rapid adoption cycle explains the explosive growth in Norse raiding activity following initial proof-of-concept operations like Lindisfarne. Shipbuilders found themselves in particularly high demand as raid success generated increased vessel requirements. The specialized knowledge required for longship construction, selection of appropriate timber, complex joinery techniques, precise balance between strength and weight, limited production capacity even as demand surged. Historical evidence suggests shipwrights commanded premium compensation for their essential expertise, creating another avenue of social advancement connected to raid economy. Communities sometimes pooled resources to commission vessels, enabling collective participation in promising raids, demonstrating cooperative investment approach alongside individual entrepreneurship. The resulting shipbuilding boom created maritime capability far exceeding traditional fishing and trading requirements, dedicated specifically to expansionary activities. Women played crucial roles during men's absence, maintaining domestic productivity essential for community survival, while expeditionary forces sought external wealth. The management of farms, animal husbandry, food production, and child-rearing continued under female direction, ensuring subsistence needs remained met despite male workforce reduction during raiding season. This gendered division of labor allowed Norse society to simultaneously maintain traditional economic activities while pursuing new external opportunities. Archaeological evidence increasingly suggests some women may have participated directly in raids or trading expeditions, though this remained minority pattern compared to traditional role division. More commonly, women administered wealth acquired through raiding, often wearing silver and exotic materials as visible markers of family success. Perhaps most significant long-term consequence, the return and reward cycle created self-reinforcing economic system capable of sustained expansion. Initial raids generated resources, funding larger subsequent expeditions. Experience gained in early operations informed more ambitious targets in following seasons. Intelligence gathering became increasingly sophisticated as raiders recognized specific information types enabling successful operations. The reward system incentivized continued participation while ensuring sufficient distribution to maintain social cohesion despite growing wealth disparities. Unlike simple plundering for immediate consumption, this systematized approach converted raid success into a sustainable economic model that would fundamentally alter Northern European development for centuries. By the late 790s, what had begun as experimental venture at Lindisfarne had evolved into established practice with predictable patterns, understood risks, and systematic rewards. The return of successful raiders, their visible wealth enhancement, and the stories they shared had irrevocably altered Norse society's economic orientation. Communities increasingly invested resources in raid-enabling technologies rather than domestic productivity improvements. Young men oriented career aspirations toward expedition participation rather than traditional pursuits. Political leadership increasingly derived from successful raid organization rather than traditional sources of authority. The northern societies had discovered external acquisition model that promised greater returns than internal development, setting course that would reshape European history through centuries of expansion, settlement, and eventually state formation across half the known world. The Norse raids that began at Lindisfarne confronted European society with threat unlike any previously experienced, demanding response from political, religious, and military institutions unprepared for this revolutionary challenge. The initial reactions reflected confusion, theological interpretation, and limited defensive adaptation rather than coherent counter-strategy. Understanding this early European response reveals why Norse expansion continued virtually unchecked during its first decades, establishing patterns that would characterize Viking European relations for generations. Initial shock dominated European reaction to the unprecedented attacks on religious institutions. Contemporary accounts describe disbelief that sacred spaces could be violated so completely, with particular horror expressed over violence against monks who had renounced worldly protection in favor of divine care. Alcuin's famous letter, responding to Lindisfarne attack, captures this theological crisis. Behold, the church of Saint Cuthbert, spattered with the blood of the priests of God, despoiled of all its ornaments. A place more venerable than all in Britain is given as a prey to pagan peoples. This framing of events as theological catastrophe, rather than merely military defeat, reflected Christian worldview, struggling to incorporate such sacrilege into comprehensible framework. Religious interpretation predominated early understanding of Norse attacks, with Christian authorities viewing raids as divine punishment for societal sins, rather than merely human aggression requiring practical response. Church leaders attributed these disasters to moral failings within Christian communities: luxurious living, insufficient piety, inadequate religious observance, rather than strategic vulnerabilities or Norse motivations. Sermons and official communications called for increased prayer, fasting, and religious devotion as primary defense against further attacks. This theological framing, while providing psychological coping mechanism for traumatized communities, unfortunately directed response towards spiritual practices rather than practical defensive measures that might actually deter subsequent raids. Political leaders struggled to categorize and respond appropriately to threat operating outside established conflict patterns. Unlike traditional enemies, launching recognizable campaigns for territory or political advantage, Norse raiders appeared without warning, avoided direct confrontation with military forces, and disappeared before conventional response could mobilize. The mobility, unpredictability, and apparent irrationality of these attacks confounded existing security models. Kings and nobles found their military resources, typically designed for set-piece battles or siege operations, ineffective against opponents who refused expected engagement patterns while targeting undefended locations specifically selected for vulnerability. First defensive measures implemented by European authorities proved woefully inadequate against Norse operational methods. Coastal watchtowers established after initial raids provided some early warning, but lacked communication systems fast enough to summon defensive forces before raiders completed their missions. Local militias formed for community protection generally proved no match for experienced Norse warriors, often arriving after raiders had departed, or suffering decisive defeat when actual engagement occurred. These early defensive adaptations, while representing logical response to new threat, failed to address fundamental asymmetry between Norse mobility and European defensive rigidity. Monasteries began relocating treasures inland as practical response to demonstrated vulnerability, often moving valuable items to royal strongholds or better defended religious houses away from exposed coastal locations. Lindisfarne itself eventually abandoned its island location entirely, with monks carrying St. Cuthbert's remains to safer inland sanctuary. While these relocations protected specific treasures, they represented strategic victory for Norse raiders by ceding coastal regions rather than defending them effectively. The withdrawal of wealth from traditional centers also disrupted ecclesiastical functions and symbolically demonstrated Christian retreat before pagan aggression, outcomes with significant psychological impact beyond material considerations. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, fragmented by internal competition, struggled particularly to coordinate effective response to Norse incursions. Each kingdom initially viewed Viking attacks as primarily local problem rather than existential threat requiring unified action. Northumbria, suffering first significant raids, received limited support from Mercian or West Saxon neighbours who failed to recognize common danger transcending traditional rivalries. This political fragmentation allowed Norse raiders to exploit divisions, attacking targets in one kingdom while knowing others would not intervene. The absence of unified defense strategy meant raiding parties could focus attention on single vulnerable location without concern for coordinated response from neighboring territories. Frankish Empire under Charlemagne, despite its continental power, faced similar challenges protecting extensive coastlines against mobile maritime threat. The empire's military strength, centered on heavy cavalry and infantry suitable for land campaigns, provided little deterrent to seaborne raiders, capable of choosing undefended targets while avoiding imperial forces. Charlemagne reportedly wept upon seeing Norse vessels near major port, recognizing threat they represented to realm he had painstakingly constructed. His establishment of coastal defense system came too late in his reign to significantly impede early Norse incursions, though it represented first systematic attempt to address the new strategic challenge through dedicated infrastructure rather than ad hoc response. Psychological trauma inflicted by raids often exceeded their physical damage, creating disproportionate impact on European society. Contemporary accounts describe communities abandoning coastal settlements after single raid experience, preferring relocation over risk of subsequent attack. Churches incorporated prayers specifically against the fury of the Northmen into regular liturgy, institutionalizing fear within religious practice. Markets ceased operating in vulnerable locations, disrupting economic networks extending far beyond directly raided territories. This psychological dimension magnified Norse impact, far beyond actual numbers involved or physical destruction inflicted, creating widespread anxiety that itself constituted strategic victory for raiders operating with limited resources. Some European authorities attempted diplomatic approaches, seeking to understand Norse motivations or negotiate raid prevention through tribute arrangements. These early diplomatic initiatives generally failed due to fundamental misunderstanding of Norse social organization. European leaders accustomed to dealing with centralized authority found no equivalent among Norse raiders, whose expeditions operated through voluntary association rather than royal command. Agreements made with specific chieftains provided no protection against other raiders operating independently. This structural mismatch between European diplomatic assumptions and Norse political reality rendered conventional diplomatic solutions largely ineffective during early raid period. By century's end, European coastal communities had begun implementing first meaningful defensive adaptations, though still insufficient to prevent continued raids. Rudimentary early warning systems connected coastal watchtowers through signal fires or messengers. Some vulnerable communities constructed earthwork fortifications, providing basic protection against limited raiding parties. Religious establishments increasingly incorporated defensive features into new construction, while some relocated entirely from exposed positions. These practical measures, while representing improvement over initial paralysis, still addressed symptoms rather than underlying asymmetric advantage Norse raiders maintained through superior mobility and target selection flexibility. Most consequentially, for future development, some European rulers began establishing permanent defensive forces specifically tasked with coastal protection, rather than relying on general mobilization after attacks occurred. These dedicated units, while initially modest in size and effectiveness, represented conceptual breakthrough in addressing Norse threat through specialized response rather than repurposed conventional forces. Their establishment acknowledged that traditional military organizations designed for different operational environments required fundamental adaptation to counter the revolutionary challenge presented by Norse raiding tactics. The initial European reaction to Norse raids revealed societies unprepared for revolutionary threat operating outside established parameters. Theological interpretation, while providing psychological comfort, directed response toward ineffective spiritual measures rather than practical defense. Political fragmentation prevented coordinated strategy addressing common danger. Military organizations designed for different threat types struggled to adapt to enemies, refusing conventional engagement while striking vulnerable targets. These limitations allowed Norse raiders virtually unchecked operational freedom during early Viking Age, setting patterns that would characterize following century of expansion. Europe had encountered entirely new security challenge. An effective response would require fundamental reconsideration of defense assumptions that had prevailed since Roman times. As the 9th century opened across Europe, what had begun as isolated Norse raids transformed into sustained maritime offensive, unprecedented in scale, sophistication, and impact. The initial successes at Lindisfarne and similar targets established proof of concept for seaborne raiding model, unleashing expansionary energy that would reshape European development for generations. This rising tide of Norse activity represented not merely quantitative increase in previously established patterns, but qualitative transformation in operational methods, strategic ambition, and long-term consequences. The half-century, between 800 to 850 AD, witnessed decisive shift from opportunistic raiding towards systematic exploitation of European vulnerabilities. Raid frequency increased dramatically during this period, evolving from isolated incidents into predictable seasonal pattern terrorizing coastal communities. Historical records and archaeological evidence indicate exponential growth in Norse maritime activity, with dozens of separate expeditions departing Scandinavian shores annually during peak seasons. This quantitative expansion reflected both increased participation within Norse society and enhanced organizational capacity developed through accumulated experience. Communities that had tentatively supported exploratory ventures now enthusiastically invested resources in proven wealth acquisition model, creating self-reinforcing cycle wherein each successful season generated capability for expanded operations in subsequent years. The character of Norse expeditions evolved from hit-and-run raids towards sustained summer campaigns, maintaining extended presence in target territories. Rather than single attacks followed by immediate withdrawal, Norse forces increasingly established temporary bases from which they conducted multiple operations across wider areas. This operational evolution dramatically expanded their effective range while reducing risk associated with long-distance return voyages after each individual raid. Temporary camps on islands or defensible peninsulas provided secure locations for rest, repairs, and consolidation of acquired wealth, while enabling sustained pressure against surrounding territories unable to mount effective response against these forward-operating bases. Strategic targeting grew increasingly sophisticated as Norse leaders integrated intelligence from previous expeditions into planning for subsequent operations. Initial raids had selected targets primarily based on wealth concentration and limited defenses, but expanded operations incorporated deeper understanding of political divisions, seasonal vulnerabilities, and maximum psychological impact. Areas weakened by internal conflicts received particular attention, as Norse forces demonstrated consistent ability to exploit European political fragmentation. Religious centers continued receiving disproportionate attention, not merely for their wealth, but for symbolic value of demonstrating Christian God's inability to protect his most devoted servants, creating theological crisis alongside material losses. Legendary Norse leaders began emerging during this period, whose names would enter historical record, indicating transition from anonymous raiding toward operations associated with specific charismatic commanders. Figures like Ragnar Lodbrok, whose historicity remains debated, but whose impact on contemporary consciousness was undeniable, provided focal points around which larger forces could coalesce. These leaders combined martial prowess with strategic vision, organizational capability, and psychological understanding of both followers and opponents. Their emergence represented significant development beyond earlier, small-scale raiding parties, enabling coordination of multiple ships, hundreds of warriors, and complex operations beyond capabilities of more limited expeditions. Formation of larger fleets through combined operations represented critical evolutionary step, allowing Norse forces to overwhelm defenses beyond vulnerability to smaller raiding parties. Historical sources describe fleets reaching considerable size, 30 ships and upward in some cases, carrying over 1,000 warriors capable of challenging significant defensive forces rather than merely avoiding them. These combined operations required sophisticated coordination mechanisms, agreed command structures, and equitable reward distribution systems transcending local loyalties. Their emergence demonstrated Norse organizational adaptability and capacity for collective action, despite decentralized political structures, contradicting European assumptions about barbarian limitations. The Kingdom of Northumbria experienced particularly devastating collapse under Norse pressure during this period. Following initial raids against monastic targets, Norse forces systematically dismantled Northumbrian political and economic structures through campaign operations rather than isolated attacks. The political fragmentation resulting from disputed succession after King Ethelred's death in 796 AD created ideal conditions for external exploitation. By 820 AD, major Northumbrian centers had suffered multiple devastating attacks. Economic networks had disintegrated, and political leadership had proven incapable of organizing effective resistance. This regional collapse demonstrated Norse capacity to destroy established political entities, rather than merely extract wealth from vulnerable targets. Monastic centers, previously considered secure by virtue of religious protection or geographic isolation, found themselves systematically targeted throughout this period. Iona, the legendary center of Celtic Christianity established by St. Columba, suffered devastating raids in 802 and 806 AD, forcing surviving monks to abandon this iconic island sanctuary. Jarrow and Monk Wearmouth, intellectual centers associated with the Venerable Bede, experienced similar destruction. Canterbury itself, heart of English Christianity, faced Norse attack in 842 AD, demonstrating raiders' increasing ambition and confidence. The resulting religious trauma extended far beyond material damage, as Christian communities struggled to reconcile divine promises of protection with devastating reality of sacred spaces violated by pagan aggression. Anglo-Saxon chronicles famous lament that the heathen, horribly ravaged, captured contemporary horror at Norse destructive capacity, but obscured their increasing operational sophistication. Beyond simple destruction, Norse activities during this period revealed complex strategic understanding and long-term planning. Raids specifically targeted economic choke points controlling regional trade, administrative centers housing records and governance capability, and infrastructure supporting agricultural production. This systematic approach generated effects extending far beyond immediate damage, creating cascading failures in economic and political systems dependent on targeted nodes. Rather than random destruction, Norse operations increasingly resembled calculated dismantling of targeted societies' functional capabilities. The revolutionary development of winter camps established permanent Norse presence in targeted territories, fundamentally altering the nature of Viking activity from seasonal raiding toward proto-colonization. First major winter camp established on Thanet in 850 AD marked watershed moment when Norse forces ceased returning to Scandinavia during off-season, instead maintaining year-round presence within European territories. This development created unprecedented continuous pressure on local societies, prevented recovery during traditional winter respite, and signaled transition toward territorial ambition beyond simple wealth extraction. The psychological impact on local populations, now facing permanent rather than seasonal threat, generated waves of refugees abandoning coastal regions toward defensive positions inland. Warfare methods evolved significantly during this period, as Norse forces adapted their tactics to address stronger opposition encountered during expanded operations. Shield wall techniques, where warriors formed interconnected defensive line through overlapping shields, reached sophisticated implementation, allowing Norse forces to withstand cavalry charges or superior numbers while maintaining formation integrity. Combined arms approaches integrated archers, supporting main force or detached units, executing flanking maneuvers while opponents focused on frontal engagement. Naval operations developed specific methodologies for river navigation, contested landings, and ship-to-ship combat previously unnecessary during simpler coastal raids. This tactical evolution transformed Norse forces from raiders specialized in unopposed landings to balanced military organizations capable of diverse operational environments. Irish territories experienced particularly transformative Norse attention during this period, with consequences extending beyond immediate raiding impact. Initial attacks targeting monastic centers for portable wealth evolved toward establishment of permanent Norse presence at strategic locations, controlling Irish sea trade networks. The foundation of Dublin, Dyflin, by Norse settlers in 841 AD represented watershed development, first purposeful creation of urban centre rather than temporary base. Similar Norse settlements at Waterford, Wexford, and Limerick established network of trading ports under Norse control, fundamentally altering Irish economic and political dynamics. These developments demonstrated transition from extraction toward infrastructure creation, signaling fundamental shift in Norse orientation toward targeted territories. The Frankish Empire, under Charlemagne's successors, faced mounting Norse pressure, testing the limits of imperial defensive capacity. Despite being Europe's most powerful political entity, the empire struggled against Norse mobility, exploiting its vast coastline and river systems. Particularly shocking to contemporary observers, Norse raiders navigated inland waterways to strike targets previously considered secure by virtue of distance from the sea. The Seine, Loire, and Rhine rivers became highways for Norse penetration deep into imperial heartlands, bypassing coastal defenses and creating unprecedented vulnerability throughout the realm. The First Siege of Paris in 845 AD dramatically demonstrated Norse growing ambition and operational capability. A fleet reportedly numbering 120 ships under legendary leader Ragnar navigated up the Seine to assault the Frankish capital directly, rather than limiting operations to coastal targets. This audacious attack against major inland city revealed how thoroughly Norse forces had transitioned from opportunistic raiders to strategic operators capable of challenging European powers at their centers rather than merely peripheries. Though Paris survived through combination of resistance and substantial tribute payment, the psychological impact of Norse forces threatening the Carolingian capital reverberated throughout European consciousness. Payment of the first Danegeld, £7,000 of silver, to secure Paris from destruction, established dangerous precedent that would shape European-Norse relations for generations. This massive tribute demonstrated that even the mighty Frankish Empire found direct confrontation with Norse forces sufficiently problematic to justify extraordinary expense avoiding it. The apparent success of extortion strategy naturally encouraged similar operations elsewhere, as Norse leaders recognized that threatened destruction could generate profits comparable to actual raiding while requiring less risk. European authorities increasingly found themselves choosing between ruinous resistance or expensive appeasement, neither option addressing the underlying strategic imbalance facilitating Norse operations. Carolingian Empire's weakening under continued Norse pressure revealed structural vulnerabilities beneath its impressive facade. The death of Charlemagne had left successors struggling with internal divisions even before external pressure tested imperial defenses. Norse attacks exacerbated these tensions by forcing resource allocation toward coastal and riverine defense rather than maintaining internal cohesion. The empire's traditional military strengths, heavy cavalry and professional soldiers, proved poorly adapted to countering Norse mobility and targeting strategy. Most significantly, decentralized defensive requirements accelerated devolution of authority toward local leaders capable of organizing immediate protection, undermining imperial centralization that had characterized Charlemagne's achievement. Norse ship design continued evolving in response to operational requirements encountered during expanded activities. Specialized warships incorporated features optimizing them for specific mission profiles, deeper draft vessels for open ocean voyaging, modified hulls for riverine operations, larger ships accommodating increased warrior complements for major expeditions. Merchant vessels adapted from raiding designs maintained essential seaworthiness, while maximizing cargo capacity for trading operations, increasingly complementing direct raiding. These design evolutions reflected Norse pragmatism and technical adaptability, with shipwrights continuously refining vessel characteristics based on practical experience, rather than theoretical considerations. Navigational knowledge expanded dramatically with each successful voyage, creating virtuous cycle enabling increasingly ambitious expeditions. Early raids had remained relatively close to familiar waters, but by mid-9th century, Norse vessels regularly navigated throughout North Sea, English Channel, Irish Sea, and increasingly into Atlantic waters previously considered hazardous. This geographical expansion directly resulted from practical knowledge accumulation, currents, landmarks, weather patterns, harbours, shared among maritime communities and incorporated into collective expertise. The resulting navigational capability represented strategic advantage as significant as vessel design itself, enabling operational planning impossible for less experienced maritime cultures. The rituals and symbolism surrounding Norse vessels reflected their cultural centrality beyond mere transportation function. Ship burials for prominent leaders, elaborate decorative elements despite their practical uselessness, and ships represented in artwork all demonstrated vessels' importance, transcending utilitarian considerations. Ships represented not merely tools, but cultural symbols, embodying Norse identity and aspirations. This symbolic dimension helps explain communities' willingness to invest substantial resources in vessel construction and maintenance. Beyond strict economic calculation, recognizing ships as embodiments of collective capability and prestige, comparable to religious buildings in other cultures. Shipboard life created distinctive warrior culture through shared hardship and interdependence, impossible to replicate in land-based military organizations. Men living within arm's reach for weeks develop bonds transcending normal social distinctions, creating primary loyalty to immediate companions rather than distant political entities. The necessity of absolute coordination during sailing and combat operations fostered discipline, different from but equally effective as formal military hierarchies. Leaders emerged through demonstrated competence visible to all, rather than external appointment or birth privilege. These distinctive cultural characteristics produced fighting units, whose effectiveness derived from internal cohesion and practical experience rather than external discipline or theoretical training. By mid-9th century, the rising tide of Norse activity had fundamentally altered European security landscape. Coastal regions previously considered naturally protected found themselves effectively uninhabitable, except within fortified settlements. Religious institutions had withdrawn from exposed locations toward defensible positions inland, abandoning centuries of established presence. Trade patterns had reconfigured around Norse maritime dominance, with many traditional routes disrupted while new ones developed under Norse control or influence. Political fragmentation had accelerated as local authorities proved more responsive to immediate threats than distant imperial powers. Most significantly, psychological reorientation had occurred throughout affected territories, with Norse raiders transformed from external annoyance to existential threat, demanding fundamental defensive adaptation. The half-century between 800 to 850 AD witnessed Norse expansion, transitioning from isolated phenomenon toward systemic challenge to European order. What began as opportunistic raids exploiting specific vulnerabilities had evolved into comprehensive maritime offensive reshaping political, economic, religious, and psychological landscapes across half a continent. The Norse tide had risen from isolated drops to overwhelming flood, and European societies found themselves struggling to stay afloat in transformed strategic environment. The foundations had been laid for even more dramatic developments in the later 9th century, when Norse activities would transition from raiding toward conquest and settlement that would permanently alter European development.